In the high silence of the Himalayas, where the wind carves its own alphabets into the snow and clouds drift like wandering spirits, there lies a story too strange, too fragile, and too sacred to have survived in written form. It lingers instead in rumors carried through valleys, in prayers whispered along ridgelines, and in the memories of mountains far older than any human kingdom. This is where the tale of the Pilgrim Kings begins, not in a royal court or a golden palace, but in a world perched between earth and sky, where men believed the boundary between mortal and divine could be crossed with nothing more than courage, devotion, and bare feet hardened by stone. Imagine a kingdom placed so high that even sunlight seemed to arrive in pilgrimage. A place where life depended not on armies or wealth, but on the mercy of glaciers and the discipline of breath. The altitude was a ruler of its own, punishing the unprepared, rewarding only those who understood its rhythm. Yet within this brutal beauty existed a royal lineage unlike any other, kings who refused to be anchored to their thrones, who wandered through the clouds as if seeking counsel from the heavens themselves. Their coronations were simple. Their journeys were not. Travelers who claimed to have reached this kingdom described it as a nation floating above the world. One wandering merchant wrote that he saw the king descend a cliff path barefoot, robes fluttering like prayer flags, surrounded not by bodyguards but by chanting monks. When asked why he traveled without protection, the king replied that a ruler who fears death does not deserve to guide the living. Stories like this spread far beyond the mountains, reaching courts where emperors reigned behind fortress walls and armies of bureaucrats moved like iron gears. But this Himalayan king, he moved like a pilgrim. For centuries, outsiders debated whether such a kingdom truly existed. The geography was almost mythical. Cliffs that dropped into nothingness, valleys that swallowed sound, ridges that vanished in snowstorms without warning. And yet, there were maps, strange partial drawings made by monks, traders, even soldiers who had failed to conquer the region. Each map disagreed with the next, as if the land itself refused to be captured on parchment. But one detail remained consistent. A symbol at the heart of the territory, drawn as a sun resting on 3 mountain peaks. Beneath it, a single phrase appeared again and again in different languages: the throne above the world. According to surviving fragments of oral history, the first pilgrim king had once been a warrior prince, restless and troubled. Disturbed by visions of fire and storm, he left his palace under the cover of darkness and crossed the mountains alone, seeking answers from hermits known for predicting the fates of nations. He returned months later transformed, quieter, more burdened, and strangely radiant, as though he had carried something back from the heights that ordinary men were not meant to touch. From that day onward, every king in his line followed the same tradition. Before ruling, they had to walk the pilgrim's road, disappearing into the peaks until the mountains themselves decided they were ready to return. This ritual became the beating heart of their kingdom. Children grew up hearing stories of kings who sat beside monks on cold stone floors, kings who ate from wooden bowls, kings who paused their own coronations to help lift travelers whose packs had grown too heavy. To outsiders this seemed absurd, rulers humbling themselves before the poorest of their subjects. But to the mountain people, it was the only way a king could prove he understood the land he wished to lead. And yet, beneath this beauty lay a shadow. For all their wisdom, for all their humility, the pilgrim kings were also guardians of something they refused to explain. A secret so deeply woven into their dynasty that even their closest allies were unaware of its nature. The only clue lay in the stories of those who saw the kings returning from their pilgrimages. Pale faces, trembling hands, eyes filled with visions they could not forget. Whatever they encountered in the mountains did not leave them unscarred. As centuries passed, legends multiplied. Some claimed the kings sought communion with ancient spirits that governed the rhythms of wind and frost. Others believed they protected an artifact hidden somewhere deep in the glaciers, powerful enough to change the fate of entire nations. Still others whispered of a prophecy that foretold the day when the royal line would vanish entirely, not through war or disease, but by walking together into the mountains and never returning. This was dismissed as superstition until it happened. One morning, long after the fires of night had burned out, the people of the kingdom awoke to empty thrones. The royal palace stood silent. The court chambers were abandoned. The guards had laid down their spears. No bodies were found, no clues left behind. Only a trail of footprints leading toward a high ridge where storms gathered like watchful beasts. What remained after that ridge was unknown. What the mountains took, they never returned. Word spread like wildfire across the trade routes. Monks wept. Travelers spoke in hushed tones. And distant kings sent envoys, terrified of what it meant for a royal family, one so spiritually revered, to disappear without a trace. But the mountains held their secrets. Today, only fragments of their story remain. Carvings hidden beneath snow, songs sung by shepherds, scrolls left half-finished by monks who died before completing their work. Yet the mystery persists because it demands to be told, because a kingdom does not simply vanish unless something far greater than power or politics is at play. Something ancient, something immense, something that may still be waiting above the clouds. And so the question echoes across the same ridges the pilgrim kings once walked. What force called an entire royal bloodline away from their thrones? And why did they go willingly? The ancient road into the Himalayan kingdom was not a single path but a living organism. A network of trails that shifted with the seasons, carved not by human ambition but by wind, glaciers, and the instincts of mountain goats. Travelers called it the Road of Winds and Bones, a name earned from centuries of pilgrimage and peril. To walk it meant stepping into a landscape that cared nothing for human survival. One wrong move, one misjudged step, and the mountains claimed another life. Yet, despite its dangers, thousands undertook the journey every year, and among them walked kings. Each path carried the weight of stories older than the kingdoms below. Some routes were little more than narrow ledges scratched into cliffs, where travelers pressed their backs against rock as avalanches rumbled somewhere above. Others wound through valleys known for sudden blizzards that could erase entire caravans in minutes. The bones scattered along the trails were not symbols of tragedy alone, but markers, constant reminders that survival here was a negotiation rather than a guarantee. Every pilgrim understood this truth. Every king accepted it. The pilgrims themselves formed a tapestry of humanity rarely seen elsewhere. Monks recited prayers as they walked, their chants rising like incense into the thin air. Traders led mules loaded with salt, wool, and rare herbs. Farmers seeking blessings for their harvests trudged beside warriors hoping to cleanse the weight of battle from their spirits. Each step was a testament to devotion or desperation. On these roads, the hierarchy of the plains dissolved. A beggar might share a fire with a nobleman, and a wandering monk might advise a future king. Titles meant nothing when the mountains tested every soul equally. Those who traveled the road often spoke of strange phenomena that blurred the boundary between myth and reality. Winds carried harmonics that sounded like distant flutes, though no musician could be found. Shadows appeared on ridgelines only to vanish when approached. And on certain nights, travelers claimed the sky glowed with a pale, shifting light, illuminating the trails as if guiding them forward. These experiences imprinted themselves into the beliefs of the region, shaping rituals, songs, and the quiet superstitions whispered between pilgrims as they rested by mountain fires. For the pilgrim kings, these roads were more than routes between places. They were stages upon which their destinies unfolded. Every king walked them not as a ruler but as a seeker. Tradition required the royal heir to leave the palace as a common pilgrim and return, if they survived, as a sovereign chosen by both the people and the mountains. The journey served as initiation, trial, and revelation. Some heirs returned transformed, some returned broken, and some never returned at all. Foreign chroniclers, who managed to reach these routes only with great difficulty, left surprisingly consistent descriptions despite coming from distant cultures. A Persian traveler wrote of winds that speak, insisting he once heard his name carried across a ravine long before his companions reached him. A Chinese emissary recorded intricate rock carvings depicting kings walking with staffs instead of swords, surrounded by symbols he did not recognize. Even an early European adventurer, who barely survived the altitude, described a sense of being watched by the mountains themselves. But what intrigued these chroniclers most was a detail repeated again and again: the claim that these routes were older than any known kingdom, older than recorded history itself. Locals insisted the trails had been used by wandering sages long before kings existed, suggesting that the royal tradition of pilgrimage was inherited from a spiritual lineage lost to time. This idea sparked debates among scholars. If the roads predated the kingdom, what ancient purpose had they served? Why did the kings risk everything to walk them? Near the midpoint of one of the major routes stood a stone pillar carved with patterns so weathered that only fragments remained legible. Pilgrims paused here to rest, offer incense, or tie prayer flags that danced violently in the mountain winds. The inscriptions hinted at a past ruler who crossed the mountains not for power, but to guard a secret entrusted to the high places. The implication was unsettling. The pilgrimages might not have been symbolic acts of humility at all. They might have been connected to something hidden deep within the range, something the kings were sworn to protect. As time passed, more clues emerged from oral tradition. Elders in remote villages recounted stories of kings who walked the road of winds and bones to consult the spirits of the peaks, a phrase scholars later interpreted as ancient metaphors for hermits, mystics, or perhaps even something beyond human understanding. These villagers believed the mountains could reveal destinies through visions granted at specific sacred sites along the road. Such visions, according to their legends, shaped the decisions of the kings more than any council or advisor. Travelers who followed the routes during the final century of the kingdom reported a growing unease among the pilgrims. Storms became more frequent. Strange symbols began appearing on rocks and cliffs, some carved fresh, others revealed as snow melted. There were whispers that the king's pilgrimages were becoming longer, more dangerous, as if they were searching for something or fleeing from it. Even the monks who guided the routes seemed burdened with knowledge they refused to share. By the time the final royal family embarked on their last journey, the road of winds and bones had transformed from a spiritual path into a corridor of prophecy. The people sensed that something was coming. The roads felt different, charged with a tension that travelers could neither name nor escape. And yet the kings walked them with steady steps, as though answering a call only they could hear. It was on these same roads that the first clues of their disappearance would appear, in footprints that began bold but faded into nothingness, in travelers who swore they heard chanting when no one else was near, and in mountain winds that carried words impossible to decipher. These trails were both witnesses and participants in the final chapter of the Pilgrim-Kings story. The secrets they held were etched not in scrolls or royal archives, but in the unforgiving terrain itself. The road was the first riddle. The kings were the second. What connected them was a mystery still waiting to be understood. The story of the first pilgrim king begins not in opulence, but in unrest. He was a prince born to a lineage that had ruled the high valleys for generations. Yet from the moment of his birth, the mountains seemed to whisper warnings in the wind. The palace, a fortress perched on cliffs above cascading rivers, was a place of gold and banners, of ceremonies and feasts. But within its walls, the young prince felt the pull of something greater than the throne. A force that demanded both humility and courage, the kind that no tutor, soldier, or sage could teach. As he grew, his dreams were haunted by visions. Snow turning red with fire, clouds parting to reveal stairways of light, and voices carried on the wind calling him toward the peaks. The court dismissed these as youthful fantasies, but the prince knew they were instructions, not illusions. He began to prepare in secret. He observed the movements of monks, traders, and pilgrims who traversed the rugged passes. He learned to endure the biting cold, to read the signs of avalanches, to navigate cliffs slick with ice. His education was no longer confined to scrolls or scholars. It was being forged on the stone paths that no one of noble birth had dared tread. Yet even as he trained his body, he wrestled with the fear of leaving everything he knew behind. A kingdom awaited him, and yet the mountains whispered that his destiny lay elsewhere. Finally, one pre-dawn morning, he departed. The corridors of the palace were empty, his footprints in the dust soon erased by the morning wind. He carried nothing but a simple robe, a staff, and a small satchel of dried provisions. There were no guards, no banners, no ceremonial send-off. The court awoke later to discover his absence and a letter. A single line, written in ink so faint it almost seemed invisible. "I walk to find what I must give away. No one could understand it. Scholars speculated it was a test of courage. Historians later suggested it was a renunciation of power. Yet in the mountains, the prince felt neither fear nor uncertainty, only the weight of anticipation. The journey was brutal beyond imagination. Narrow ledges threatened to collapse underfoot. Sudden storms raged without warning, and avalanches whispered death in the distance. But for the prince, each hardship was a lesson. He learned to listen to the wind as one listens to a teacher, to sense the movement of clouds as though they were guiding him. In the silence of snowfields and the echoing canyons, he confronted his own limitations. Hunger, exhaustion, and the sharp sting of solitude pressed upon him, but they also clarified his purpose. Every step became a question, and every question a revelation. Slowly, the line between the prince and the pilgrim blurred. He was no longer merely a boy who had been born to rule. He was becoming something else, something the mountains demanded of their chosen. During this time, he encountered other travelers, hermits who had lived in the high passes for decades, wandering monks, and merchants carrying rare goods to distant kingdoms. To them, he appeared as an unremarkable pilgrim, yet they noticed something in his eyes, an intensity, a hunger for understanding, and an awareness of forces beyond the ordinary. One hermit, known for predicting events before they occurred, told him, "You seek a crown, but the mountains demand a different kind, one made of silence and sacrifice." The prince understood this cryptically at first, but each passing day confirmed the truth. Rulership, as he had been taught in palaces, was meaningless without a deeper comprehension of life's rhythms, of wind, snow, and the fragile impermanence of human power. Weeks turned into months. The prince survived blizzards, treacherous ice fields, and avalanches that would have ended lesser travelers. He crossed ridges where a misstep meant instant death, yet he pressed forward with an unrelenting determination. Along the way, he discovered hidden shrines, long-forgotten markers of kings who had walked these paths before him. Each shrine contained symbols carved in stone, suns eclipsed by mountains, serpents coiled around stars, and cryptic phrases in languages lost to time. He interpreted them as guidance, perhaps left by those who had glimpsed the same truths he sought. The mountains were teaching him not only endurance but vision, how to see beyond the immediate, beyond even the kingdom he was born to rule. When he finally reached the high plateau known in whispers as the White Silence, he understood the culmination of his pilgrimage. Here, the winds carried voices, and the clouds formed shapes that seemed almost human. Here, he felt the presence of something vast, ancient, and unyielding. The prince knelt in the snow, offering no prayers, for words felt inadequate. He simply waited, for what he did not yet know. And then, as the sun broke the horizon in a blast of cold light, he saw it. A vision of the kingdom he was to inherit, not as a fortress of stone, but as a living network of people, paths, and secrets bound to the mountains themselves. The lesson was clear: rulership without understanding the land and the spiritual currents that shaped it was meaningless. When he returned to his palace months later, he was unrecognizable. His hair was wind-bleached, his hands scarred by stone and ice, and his eyes carried a depth that unsettled courtiers. Yet his presence commanded not through fear or decree, but through something subtler, a knowledge born of trial, a calm that spoke louder than any edict. He brought with him not treasures, but teachings, stories of the paths, and a set of rituals that would define the line of pilgrim kings for generations. From that day onward, every successor had to walk the same path, endure the same trials, and confront the same silence of the high peaks. Those who returned were rulers. Those who did not became part of legend. And so, the first pilgrim king was not remembered for battles fought or lands conquered, but for the journey he undertook alone, a journey that redefined the very meaning of kingship in the Himalayas. It was the origin of a dynasty whose fate would forever intertwine with the mountains. A lineage of rulers who vanished into the clouds, walked among whispers, and carried a secret that would echo through centuries. What he discovered in those peaks was a template, a rite of passage, and a warning. For the mountains, as he learned, demanded more than courage or loyalty. They demanded surrender to a higher purpose. And in the story of that first king, the shadows of every subsequent disappearance would already be cast. The palace of the Pilgrim Kings was unlike any other in the world. From the outside, it appeared as a fortress of stone and would clinging to cliffs that disappeared into clouds. Its walls were thick enough to withstand both armies and storms. Yet inside, the atmosphere was permeated by incense, prayer, and the quiet murmur of reflection. The throne room was sparsely decorated, with sunlight filtering through carved lattices, illuminating dust motes that danced like spirits in the high-altitude air. Here, power was displayed not in gold or jewels, but in presence, in the measured steps of the king, the calm weight of his gaze, and the rituals that intertwined governance with the divine. The kings of this lineage were paradoxes. On one hand, they commanded armies, negotiated treaties, and collected taxes from villagers in distant valleys. They wielded authority with the precision of generals, ensuring that roads remained passable, that bridges survived the winter torrents, and that grain and medicine reached the high settlements before snow trapped them for months. Their people revered them, not only for their courage but for their uncanny ability to balance authority with compassion. They were rulers who could punish without cruelty and reward without arrogance. Yet, these same kings would leave the comfort of their courts to walk for months along perilous mountain paths, abandoning their palaces for meditation, fasting, and ritual. These pilgrimages were more than tradition. They were a crucible. Each king undertook the journey barefoot, dressed in simple robes, carrying nothing but a staff and the guidance of those who had walked before them. Their purpose was to strip away the privileges and comforts that might cloud judgment, to confront the raw forces of nature, and to discover the limits of human endurance. The court and the palace were left behind, along with the trappings of authority, leaving the king exposed to wind, snow, and solitude. It was not uncommon for the monarch to emerge weeks later, sometimes months, altered in appearance, tone, and temperament. This transformation was a visible symbol to the people. Power was not inherited alone. It was earned through humility, suffering, and understanding. Within the palace, courtiers and advisors whispered about the peculiar ways of these kings. Some found their absences maddening, fearing that the throne might weaken without constant supervision. Others admired the courage it demanded, believing that a ruler who walked with the mountains held insight unavailable to those chained to ceremonial duties. The kings themselves understood both perspectives but did not waver. Authority was not measured by control over others, they believed, but by mastery over oneself and one's alignment with forces far greater than human ambition. In essence, the throne was not just a seat of power. It was a reflection of the inner order a king had cultivated amidst snow, wind, and silence. The tension between their worldly and spiritual duties often produced moments of drama, both subtle and profound. There were instances when a king would return from a pilgrimage pale and shaken, having witnessed visions or omens that the most learned priests could not interpret. One chronicle tells of a monarch who, after weeks in the high passes, spoke only in riddles for days, describing bridges made of light and voices carved into stone. His advisors feared madness, yet the people understood. The mountains had imparted a truth too immense for ordinary comprehension. Such experiences reinforced the belief that the Pilgrim Kings were both human and something beyond, intermediaries between the mortal realm and the divine forces governing their peaks. The duality of their existence extended to their daily lives as rulers. By day, they commanded respect, arbitrated disputes, and upheld justice with a keen eye. By night, they engaged in rituals drawn from centuries of esoteric knowledge, often involving meditation, sacred chants, and offerings at altars that reflected celestial alignments. Their schedules were grueling, but the discipline reinforced a worldview in which governance, spirituality, and nature were inseparable. Every decision, from taxation to diplomacy, was colored by this awareness. The land itself was a living entity, and a king who ignored its rhythms risked not only personal failure but the ruin of his entire realm. Yet, this balance was precarious. The kings were deeply human, prone to doubt, fear, and even longing for the comfort of simpler lives. Some struggled with the isolation imposed by their pilgrimages, the weight of unseen responsibilities, and the knowledge that the mountains often demanded sacrifices too heavy for ordinary men. Diaries and scrolls preserved in monasteries hint at these moments of vulnerability. Entries that describe sleepless nights, aching joints, and visions that terrified even the most stoic rulers. And yet, these admissions of fear did not diminish their authority. They reinforced it. The people saw not only the majesty of the kings but their courage in confronting the unknown, both within and beyond themselves. Perhaps the most enigmatic aspect of the Pilgrim Kings was the purpose of their journeys. Scholars have debated whether these excursions were religious, political, or a combination of both. The evidence suggests a complex interplay. The pilgrimages reinforced spiritual discipline, allowed kings to commune with sacred sites, and provided a controlled environment to test leadership under extreme conditions. The routes they followed were ancient, predating even the earliest written records of the kingdom, suggesting that the act of walking itself was a sacred inheritance, a ritual as vital as any coronation or ceremony performed within the palace walls. By completing the pilgrimage, a king affirmed his legitimacy in the eyes of both his people and the unseen forces of the mountains. In the end, the story of the Pilgrim Kings reveals a profound truth. Power, in this kingdom, was never simple. It was not granted by birthright alone, nor secured through armies or wealth. It was earned through endurance, insight, and the courage to confront forces beyond human control. The throne of ash and prayer, as chroniclers would later describe it, was a paradoxical seat, rooted in both humility and majesty, in worldly command and spiritual surrender. It demanded kings who could wield authority without arrogance, who could walk barefoot through the highest passes and return to rule wisely. And it is precisely this duality, this intricate dance between governance and pilgrimage, between mortality and transcendence, that set the stage for the mysteries that would unfold, mysteries that would see the kingdom itself disappear into the clouds. The stage was set, the tension between earth and sky palpable, and the next generation of kings would inherit not just a throne, but a path fraught with peril, wonder, and secrets that no human had fully comprehended. Hidden deep within the jagged peaks of the Himalayas were monasteries so remote that even the most intrepid travelers doubted their existence. Perched on cliff edges, carved into sheer rock faces, or tucked into mist-shrouded valleys, these sanctuaries were far more than places of worship. They were repositories of knowledge, archives of memory, and guardians of secrets entrusted by generations of pilgrim kings. To reach them, one had to traverse paths that could erase a careless step, cross glaciers that groaned with age, and navigate ravines where avalanches could strike without warning. The monks who inhabited these monasteries were not passive observers. They were custodians, initiates, and sometimes conspirators in a lineage that blended spiritual devotion with political foresight. Many of the monasteries were known only to the royal family. Their locations were passed down in cryptic maps, oral chants, and coded instructions designed to confound outsiders. Even neighboring villages often had only vague awareness of their existence, speaking in hushed tones of the high houses, where wisdom was exchanged between men cloaked in saffron and travelers who had journeyed further than ordinary humans dared. Some of these monasteries were hundreds of years old, built during a time when the first pilgrim king walked the mountains in search of guidance. It is said that he personally consecrated the earliest of these sanctuaries, ensuring that the rites performed within would remain untouched by worldly politics and the ambitions of lesser men. Inside, the monasteries were labyrinthine. Narrow corridors led to meditation halls filled with carved idols, frescoes depicting kings walking among the clouds, and manuscripts that chronicled journeys so dangerous they seemed impossible. Scrolls described rituals that required alignment with celestial events, meticulous counting of steps along sacred trails, and offerings to natural forces such as glaciers, rivers, and winds. Some texts spoke of the king's encounters with mysterious travelers, spirits, or visions that imparted knowledge no ordinary scholar could decipher. The monks preserved these accounts, understanding that the survival of the kingdom itself might depend on the wisdom hidden in these records. The relationship between the pilgrim kings and the monasteries was intimate yet complex. While the kings depended on the monks for guidance, protection, and interpretation of sacred knowledge, the monks relied on the royalty to maintain the sanctity and secrecy of the pilgrimage paths. This symbiosis created an invisible network of loyalty and trust, one that spanned generations and bound the spiritual and political realms together. Occasionally, a king would remain in a monastery for months, not out of obligation but as an act of learning and reflection. In such cases, the monks recorded his thoughts, dreams, and decisions, creating a living archive of rulership intertwined with pilgrimage, devotion, and the harsh lessons of the mountains. Among the most fascinating of these sanctuaries were those that were deliberately hidden, accessible only via routes known to a select few. To outsiders, these monasteries seemed unreachable, suspended in mist or behind natural barriers that defied navigation. Yet for a king on pilgrimage, these obstacles were invitations, tests designed to separate those who were prepared for insight from those unready for the weight of truth. Some chroniclers describe crossing a snow-bridged gorge where the air shimmered with unseen energy, or navigating cliffside steps that vanished when covered with fresh snow, only to reappear when the right rhythm of steps was maintained. It was said that the monasteries themselves were alive in some way, responsive to the presence, intentions, and discipline of those who approached. Within these walls, monks and kings engaged in practices that were at once spiritual and practical. Meditation sessions could last days, punctuated only by the sounds of wind, water, and distant avalanche. Kings would fast, chant, and participate in rituals involving complex symbols etched in stone floors, sometimes accompanied by instruments whose tones resonated across valleys and canyons. The purpose of these ceremonies was not merely religious. They were exercises in endurance, clarity, and preparation. A king who could maintain focus amidst exhaustion, cold, and isolation was deemed capable of guiding a kingdom where survival depended on understanding both natural and human forces. The monk's role was to observe, record, and guide without interference, ensuring that each ruler emerged with wisdom that transcended ordinary instruction. The monasteries also contained artifacts that defied explanation. Carved relics, ancient texts, and mysterious objects were carefully preserved and, in some cases, hidden behind secret doors. Some chroniclers later suggested that these items held knowledge or power that might have influenced the decisions of the pilgrim-kings in ways historians could scarcely imagine. A particularly curious manuscript described a ceremonial journey that, when performed correctly, allowed a king to communicate with the mountains themselves, reading signs in wind patterns, snow formations, and the behavior of animals. While modern scholars debate the literal truth of such claims, there is no question that these monasteries cultivated a level of understanding and observation that was both rigorous and extraordinary. It was here, in these secluded sanctuaries, that the kings received the instructions for the journeys that would define their reigns. The pilgrimages were rarely about conquest or glory. They were exercises in understanding the precarious balance of power, faith, and the environment. The monks provided guidance on when to depart, which trails to follow, and which rituals to perform. Failure to adhere to these teachings was considered dangerous, potentially inviting misfortune not only for the king but for the entire kingdom. These warnings were not idle superstition. The mountains had long demonstrated their lethal authority, and the monks acted as interpreters of the forces that could not be directly controlled. Yet, within the monasteries, there were hints of a secret that even the kings themselves scarcely acknowledged. Hidden in manuscripts, inscriptions, and coded teachings was reference to a final pilgrimage, one from which no ruler had ever returned. Some monks suggested it was symbolic, a test of ultimate faith. Others hinted at something more tangible, an ancient pact, a relic, or a knowledge so powerful it demanded absolute discretion. The ambiguity of this secret created tension within the corridors of the monasteries, blending reverence with fear. Each king who embarked on the path carried not only the burden of rulership, but the weight of a mystery preserved through centuries, whispered in chants and carved into stone. As centuries passed, the monasteries maintained their vigilance. Travelers who stumbled upon them spoke of monks who seemed impossibly old, yet who moved with alertness and strength, and of scrolls that chronicled events hundreds of years before their time. The sanctuaries survived earthquakes, avalanches, and political upheavals, preserving their secrets through meticulous care and devotion. They became more than spiritual centers. They were archives of a lost world, recording the intersection of mortal kings and eternal mountains. And at the heart of it all was the unspoken understanding. The pilgrim kings' journeys were incomplete without the guidance of the monks, and the monastery's purpose was inseparable from the survival, ritual, and mystery of the royal line. It was within these walls, amid stone, snow, and silence, that the foundations of the kingdom's most enduring and haunting legends were laid. In a dusty European archive, far from the peaks of the Himalayas, a scholar discovered a map so precise and detailed that it seemed impossible for its time. The parchment was fragile, stained with age, yet the ink held a clarity that defied centuries. Mountains rose and fell on the page with exacting contours. Rivers wound through valleys in ways that matched modern surveys, and hidden passes were marked with symbols that no cartographer from the era should have known. What drew the scholar's attention most was a series of annotations in a script that resembled a hybrid of local Himalayan glyphs and Sanskrit characters, describing routes that led to monasteries and secluded temples previously considered mythical. The map was not signed, nor was there any record of who had created it. Yet, its existence posed a startling question. How could anyone outside the kingdom have known these paths with such intimate precision? The map did more than chart geography. It suggested knowledge of the kingdom's secrets. Certain routes were marked as paths of awakening, while others bore warnings, symbols resembling crosses, spirals, or eyes carved into the margins, that scholars later interpreted as signs of danger or sacred significance. Some pathways ended abruptly in shaded areas labeled with cryptic phrases, such as, "the silence beyond snow," or "where the sky whispers." These were areas no outsider was thought to have reached, yet the map contained them with an accuracy that implied first-hand observation. For historians, this challenged everything they knew about Himalayan exploration at the time. Could someone have infiltrated the royal pilgrimages and returned to document them? Or was there an older network of observers, independent of the kings themselves, who preserved knowledge unknown to the rest of the world? The provenance of the map was equally mysterious. Found among the private papers of a minor European noble who had traveled through Asia during the 17th century, there was no mention of how he obtained it. Some historians speculated that it had been smuggled out of the region by a trader, a diplomat, or even a spy, someone whose allegiance and purpose were lost to time. Yet, the cartography was too sophisticated for a simple traveler to have produced it. The way contours, elevation, and sacred sites were depicted suggested collaboration with someone intimately familiar with the terrain, perhaps even a member of the royal family itself. The implication was staggering. Someone had managed to penetrate the kingdom's inner sanctums and return to the outside world with knowledge that the kings had carefully guarded for generations. The routes depicted on the map also offered tantalizing clues about the purpose of the pilgrim kings' journeys. Lines led from palaces to remote monasteries, along trails that crossed glaciers, scaled cliffs, and wound through ravines where avalanches had claimed countless lives. Symbols indicated stopping points, perhaps shrines, meditation sites, or places where the kings would perform rituals. Some paths were marked with stars or crescents, suggesting alignment with celestial events. This implied that the pilgrimages were not random acts of devotion, but carefully orchestrated journeys, designed to correspond with the cycles of the moon, the sun, and the rare alignment of planets. The map, therefore, was more than a guide. It was a record of sacred knowledge, an instrument of both geography and spirituality, encoded in symbols that only those trained in the tradition could fully interpret. The scholar who studied the map noted peculiar inconsistencies. Some routes seemed to defy the natural topography. Mountains that should have blocked passage were shown as traversable, rivers as easily crossed, and cliffs marked with ladders or bridges that did not appear in any other historical record. These anomalies sparked heated debate. Were they artistic exaggerations, symbolic representations of spiritual journeys, or evidence that the kingdom's engineers had constructed hidden pathways long forgotten by time? Some suggested that the map contained instructions not for ordinary travel but for the ritualized pilgrimages undertaken by the kings themselves, a secret guide that allowed them to navigate deadly terrain with confidence while remaining invisible to outsiders. Foreign scholars and historians who examined the map were both fascinated and unnerved. Its precision implied an intelligence network, a knowledge system that exceeded the technological and cultural capacities attributed to the region at the time. If the map was genuine, it meant that the kingdom had been observed, studied, and perhaps even manipulated from afar, its secrets no longer confined to the high valleys. The implications were profound. The Pilgrim Kings were not merely spiritual rulers, but participants in a landscape of intrigue and surveillance that stretched far beyond the Himalayas. Someone, somewhere, had taken meticulous note of their every step, perhaps with the intent to exploit, to learn, or to preserve knowledge of a civilization that the world had long considered inaccessible. Even more startling were marginal annotations suggesting warnings about the final pilgrimage, the one from which no king had ever returned. Symbols resembling fire, eyes, and clouds were accompanied by phrases that could be interpreted as instructions or cautionary notes. Could the mapmaker have known the fate that awaited the Pilgrim Kings? Or was he merely recording what he had observed, leaving future generations to puzzle over the mysterious vanishings that were already part of legend? The ambiguity of the notes added layers of intrigue, hinting at forces, human or otherwise, that had monitored the kingdom with an almost obsessive intensity. As word of the map spread, modern researchers began tracing its routes, attempting to correlate them with existing trails and archaeological finds. Some paths corresponded perfectly with known monasteries and settlements, while others led into glaciers, deep canyons, or sheer cliffs with no sign of human passage. Explorers who dared follow the hidden paths sometimes reported inexplicable phenomena. Sudden mists that seemed to shift direction, footprints appearing where none should exist, and the faint echo of chanting carried on the wind. Whether coincidence, natural illusion, or something more mystical, the map had awakened a new awareness of the kingdom's reach and the perilous precision with which the kings conducted their pilgrimages. In the end, the map was more than a historical curiosity. It was evidence of a hidden layer of the world, a network of knowledge linking geography, spirituality, and royal practice in a way that challenged everything scholars believed about the Himalayas. It suggested that the Pilgrim Kings' secrets were never fully confined to the mountains themselves. They had left traces that could survive, carefully encoded, across continents and centuries. And as the shadows of these routes continued to whisper in modern research and the memories of highland villagers, one question remained, chilling in its simplicity. If outsiders could record what the kings themselves risked their lives to protect, who else might have known the ultimate fate of the royal line? The valleys of the Himalayas are deceptive. From a distance, they appear serene. Rivers glinting like silver ribbons, forests thick with pine and rhododendron, villages nestled like ornaments on terraces. Yet anyone who has entered these valleys knows the truth. Beauty in this region is inseparable from danger. Landslides, avalanches, and sudden snowstorms could wipe out entire communities in hours, and hidden crevices swallowed the unwary without trace. For the Pilgrim Kings, the valleys were both lifelines and trials, places where human resilience was measured against the raw, indifferent power of nature. Every settlement they passed, every river crossed, was part of a larger choreography that tested their ability to lead, endure, and understand the lives of those they ruled. Villages in the high valleys were small, tight-knit, and fiercely self-sufficient. They lived in constant negotiation with the elements, planting crops in short growing seasons, raising livestock hardy enough to survive brutal winters, and passing down oral traditions that carried both practical knowledge and mystical lore. For these communities, the king's pilgrimages were both awe-inspiring and essential. A visit from the monarch could mean blessings for the land, guidance for disputes, or the simple reassurance that the forces governing the peaks had acknowledged their existence. Pilgrim Kings did not merely pass through. They engaged with the people, sometimes sitting for days in local homes, observing, listening, and learning. It was a practice that ensured rulership was grounded in empathy as well as authority. The interactions between the kings and villagers were layered with ritual and subtle power dynamics. In some villages, a king would perform symbolic acts, offering prayers at the edge of fields, helping carry water, or assisting with repairs after winter storms. To an outsider, these gestures might appear ceremonial or quaint, but to those living under the constant threat of natural calamity, they carried deep significance. They reinforced a reciprocal relationship, the king gained insight into the resilience and needs of his people, while the villagers received tangible and spiritual reinforcement of their place within a kingdom governed by someone attuned to both human and natural law. But the valleys were also repositories of warning. Elders told stories of kings who had misjudged the currents of rivers, underestimated avalanches, or ignored omens in the wind, only to suffer misfortune. These narratives were recorded in oral histories, songs, and murals depicting figures falling into chasms, or standing frozen in snowstorms. They served as both caution and instruction, embedding a sense of vigilance and respect for the natural world within the collective consciousness. For the Pilgrim Kings, these lessons were critical. A ruler who disregarded them risked more than personal harm: the well-being of entire villages, the security of trade routes, and the stability of the kingdom hung in balance. Trade routes threaded through these valleys, linking the highlands to distant regions. Merchants carrying salt, wool, spices, and precious metals moved along treacherous paths, often in caravans that required precise timing and careful planning. The kings, during their pilgrimages, would often travel alongside these traders, not as overseers, but as participants in the rhythms of daily life. By walking among merchants, shepherds, and artisans, they gained insight into the practical workings of commerce, the vulnerabilities of supply chains, and the interdependence of distant communities. These excursions reinforced the notion that rulership was not abstract. It was lived and tested in the smallest interactions, where one miscalculation could have far-reaching consequences. The high valleys also held hidden spiritual significance. Certain peaks, springs, and groves were considered sacred, believed to be inhabited by spirits, ancestors, or deities who influenced the weather, fertility of the land, and the fate of those who walked among them. The king's visits to these sites were ritualized, often involving offerings, chants, and silent reflection. Local guides, deeply versed in the lore, would accompany them, interpreting omens in the flight of birds, the shape of clouds, or the sound of distant waterfalls. These rituals were not superstitious frills. They were mechanisms of understanding a world where survival depended on subtle observation, intuition, and respect for forces beyond human control. Occasionally, the valleys revealed evidence of past calamities. Entire fields buried under rockslides, abandoned villages where snow had claimed lives in silence, or carvings warning travelers of hidden dangers. Pilgrim kings paid attention to these signs, incorporating the knowledge into their strategies for governance and pilgrimage. Every decision, from negotiating with local chieftains to allocating resources for winter, was informed by a nuanced comprehension of both human behavior and environmental patterns. Their authority was strengthened not through force alone, but by an intimate knowledge of the land and its people. Yet the valleys were not simply practical training grounds. They were crucibles for understanding the human psyche. Kings observed fear, courage, despair, and resilience, witnessing how communities responded to the pressures of isolation and nature's caprice. Some villagers displayed extraordinary bravery, risking life to rescue trapped livestock or repair vital infrastructure after avalanches. Others succumbed to desperation, leaving homes to wander into snowstorms, never to return. These observations informed not only the king's rule but their philosophy. Authority was inseparable from empathy, and survival depended on understanding the fragility and strength of human hearts in equal measure. Finally, the valleys were stages for encounters with the unknown. Stories persisted of strange lights along ridgelines, mysterious figures glimpsed at twilight, and echoes of chants that seemed to come from the mountains themselves. Pilgrim kings reported visions that appeared in valleys rather than peaks. Animals behaving unnaturally, sudden mists that obscured paths and then vanished, and sounds that carried messages only the attentive could interpret. To outsiders, these might have seemed fanciful. To the kings and the monks guiding them, they were integral to the journey. Signs that the mountains were alive, aware, and testing those who sought to claim authority over them. Through these valleys, the Pilgrim Kings walked the delicate line between power and humility, between human desire and the impartial forces of nature. The lessons learned here, in the whispered warnings of elders, the resilience of villagers, the perilous trade routes, and the silent, watchful mountains, became the foundation of a philosophy that defined the dynasty. The valleys were both mirror and mentor, revealing the limits of human control and the necessity of respect for forces greater than oneself. And as each king traversed these lands, they carried forward an understanding that would ultimately guide and haunt every step of their extraordinary pilgrimages into the clouds. The peaks of the Himalayas are not merely mountains. They are sentinels of time, weathered witnesses to centuries of human ambition, devotion, and disappearance. For the pilgrim kings, these peaks were more than obstacles to traverse. They were teachers, arbiters, and sometimes judges. To the uninitiated, the mountains might appear indifferent, but those who walked their trails understood that each ridge, crevice, and snowfield carried meaning, a message woven into the harsh terrain. Avalanches were not random. Storms were not mere weather. Every element of the landscape had a rhythm, a logic that only those who paid attention could interpret. The kings learned to read these signs, to anticipate danger, and to understand the subtle language of the high places, where life and death balanced on a single step. The high passes were notoriously treacherous. Narrow ledges that seemed impassable at first glance often concealed paths worn smooth by generations of pilgrims, their surfaces glistening with ice in early mornings, slick with rain in the monsoon months. One misjudged footing could send a traveler tumbling hundreds of feet into ravines choked with jagged rocks and snow. Glaciers groaned and shifted without warning, creating crevices that could swallow a man whole. Yet the pilgrim kings did not falter. They moved with deliberate steps, staffs probing the snow and stone, observing the behavior of animals, listening to the wind's nuanced shifts, and adjusting their paths accordingly. The mountains demanded more than courage. They demanded intuition, patience, and a willingness to surrender control. Encounters along the peaks were as rare as they were significant. Hermits who had lived alone for decades, wandering ascetics, and shamans inhabiting caves offered cryptic guidance, warnings, and sometimes lessons that could not be learned in the courts below. These encounters were fleeting, yet transformative. A single word, gesture, or symbol might resonate for weeks, guiding decisions or shaping rituals that would define a king's reign. One chronicle recounts a king finding an ancient staff embedded in a rock, carved with runes that shimmered faintly in the sunlight. He took it with him, interpreting it as a sign that the mountains acknowledged his passage. Such artifacts and moments were rare, yet their significance was magnified by the isolation and peril of the peaks. The physical dangers of altitude were compounded by psychological strain. Oxygen-thin air taxed every heartbeat, clouds obscured paths and disoriented travelers, and the silence could be deafening. Pilgrim kings reported hearing voices carried on the wind, seeing shadows where none should exist, and sensing presences that defied explanation. Some dismissed these as hallucinations induced by exhaustion, hypothermia, or stress. Yet the recurrence of such experiences across generations suggested something more profound. The mountains, in their vastness, demanded not only physical endurance but an engagement with the unknown. Fear, faith, and imagination became inseparable companions on every journey. Alongside these trials, the peaks were repositories of sacred knowledge. Hidden shrines, ancient carvings, and isolated meditation caves dotted the cliffs, often invisible until approached from precise angles or under specific lighting conditions. These sites held offerings left by monks, symbols of devotion, and encoded wisdom that could guide a pilgrim through both spiritual and physical perils. Kings who discovered them recorded their experiences, often through sketches or coded manuscripts, ensuring that future generations could learn from their encounters. In some cases, these discoveries were shared with monks who would interpret their significance, translating experiences into lessons for the dynasty. The peaks also tested moral and ethical resolve. On isolated paths, kings witnessed suffering, hardship, and the consequences of human decisions amplified by the unforgiving environment. Travelers trapped by snow, villages cut off by landslides, and animals struggling for survival became living lessons in empathy and responsibility. A king who ignored these signs risked becoming detached, authoritarian, or blind to the consequences of rule. The mountains enforced humility, reinforcing the belief that true leadership required understanding both human frailty and the impartiality of nature. Legends tell of certain peaks that were deliberately avoided by all but the most courageous kings, called the silent summits. These ridges were said to carry visions of future calamities, confrontations with ancestors, or glimpses of truths too vast for ordinary comprehension. Pilgrims who ventured here often returned profoundly changed, some with new insights, others with unspoken burdens, and a few who never returned at all. These peaks became both aspiration and warning, a crucible in which the human spirit and the demands of destiny intertwined. Despite the dangers, the peaks inspired awe and reverence. Their beauty was impossible to capture in words. Sunlight scattering across glaciers, clouds swirling like living spirits, jagged ridges casting long shadows over valleys far below. Pilgrim kings often paused to meditate, sketch, or simply observe, internalizing lessons that transcended survival. These moments of quiet reflection were as critical as any trial, allowing them to integrate the physical, spiritual, and emotional experiences of the journey. The mountains were not merely obstacles. They were mentors, shaping rulers through challenge, mystery, and revelation. The significance of these peaks extended beyond personal transformation. The knowledge gained on the summits informed decisions that affected entire kingdoms. When to plant crops, how to allocate resources, the timing of festivals, and even diplomatic strategies with distant realms. Mountains were not passive scenery. They were active participants in governance, teaching kings that power was inseparable from understanding, observation, and humility. Those who underestimated them often paid dearly, while those who respected their lessons became legendary in both spiritual and historical records. In essence, the peaks represented the ultimate test for the Pilgrim Kings. They demanded endurance, insight, and courage beyond ordinary human capacity, offering both reward and consequence in equal measure. Every ridge crossed, every hidden shrine discovered, and every vision interpreted contributed to the making of a ruler capable of navigating not only the treacherous passes of the Himalayas, but the equally unpredictable terrain of human society below. The mountains held secrets, yes, but they also offered wisdom, a rare gift for those willing to risk everything to seek it. It was in these high places, where clouds brushed the skin and silence carried the weight of eternity, that the Pilgrim Kings truly became more than men. They became embodiments of a tradition that intertwined mortal authority with divine guidance, human struggle with cosmic perspective, and the enduring mysteries of the Himalayas with the fragile impermanence of human life. Each peak walked was a story written into their souls, a lesson carried into palaces, valleys, and monasteries, shaping the destiny of a kingdom that would one day vanish into the clouds, leaving only whispers and legends behind. The disappearances of the later Pilgrim Kings remain among the most enigmatic episodes in Himalayan history. Unlike the first kings, whose journeys were meticulously chronicled and whose returns were celebrated, these later monarchs seemed to vanish without a trace, leaving only whispers, footprints fading into snow, and tales that blurred the line between myth and reality. Villagers, monks, and travelers reported signs that defied logical explanation. Faint echoes of chanting in abandoned passes, smoke rising from uninhabited shrines, and sudden shifts in weather that seemed to respond to invisible presences. Each disappearance deepened the mystery, reinforcing the mountains' reputation not merely as treacherous landscapes, but as custodians of secrets no human was meant to uncover. One account tells of a king who departed during the autumn pilgrimage, dressed in simple robes, carrying only a staff and a satchel of dried provisions. He was seen by monks and local guides as he ascended the first ridge, confident and composed. Days later, his campfires were found cold, his footprints abruptly ending in a high-altitude glacier. Search parties combed valleys, cliffs, and ridges for weeks, but no body, sign, or trace of his passage beyond that point was ever discovered. The event was recorded in both monastic chronicles and local songs, the lyrics shifting over generations into ominous warnings about the mountain's capriciousness. Scholars debate whether the king perished, was guided to an unseen sanctuary, or perhaps transcended the physical realm, a question that has fueled speculation for centuries. Similar vanishings occurred with other rulers. In some cases, the last witnesses were traders or pilgrims who claimed to see the king step into swirling mist, only for him to disappear as though swallowed by the clouds themselves. Others described the faint glimmer of royal robes fluttering on a ridge in the distance, moving contrary to wind patterns, before fading into nothing. These accounts share recurring motifs: the mountains acting as active agents, the sudden cessation of physical evidence, and the persistent suggestion of intentional concealment, either by the terrain itself or by forces beyond human comprehension. The pattern was unmistakable. The higher the king climbed, the more elusive he became, until the mountains claimed him as both participant and guardian of their mysteries. The monastic communities were particularly affected by these events. Elders whispered of sacred pacts, agreements between the royal line and the unseen powers of the peaks, though the details were never fully revealed to outsiders. Some monks maintained that the disappearances were not accidents but predetermined acts, a necessary continuation of a ritual that connected mortal kings with eternal forces. It was said that the mountains chose who would return and who would remain, a process both frightening and revered. Those who survived the pilgrimage brought back wisdom and legitimacy. Those who did not became part of the mountain's legend, immortalized in chants and carvings that spoke of kings walking into the clouds and leaving behind an eternal question: what lies beyond the final ridge? Local folklore offers additional, often chilling, details. Stories persist of villages where the weather would suddenly shift in response to a king's approach. Snow falling in precise patterns, winds carrying indistinct voices, or shadows stretching in unnatural ways. Travelers occasionally reported seeing figures in ceremonial robes moving along ridges where no trail existed. In some cases, animals reacted strangely. Goats refused to cross paths, birds circled repeatedly above specific cliffs, and the howl of distant wolves seemed to follow the rhythm of unseen footsteps. These phenomena were interpreted not as coincidence but as the presence of a royal soul in transition, bridging the human and the elemental, caught between earthly authority and the inscrutable will of the mountains. Historical records hint at political implications as well. The disappearances unnerved both local administrators and foreign envoys who attempted to maintain contact with the kingdom. Treaties were delayed, trade routes became unpredictable, and alliances wavered as uncertainty surrounding the king's fates spread. Reports from neighboring realms noted that entire caravans altered their schedules, wary of traversing certain high passes where rumors suggested the last pilgrim king had vanished. The mountains were no longer just geographical features. They were instruments of power, shaping political realities with their inherent unpredictability. Modern investigations into these disappearances face numerous obstacles. The terrain is extraordinarily difficult. Glaciers shift and reshape paths annually, and avalanches erase footprints with alarming regularity. Archaeologists and historians attempting to locate traces of the vanished kings often find only remnants of ritual sites. Prayer flags tattered by wind, incense holders overturned, or carvings half buried in snow. Even where artifacts exist, they provide tantalizing but incomplete glimpses of the events. The ambiguity only adds to the allure and terror of the story, highlighting a kingdom where politics, spirituality, and geography were inextricably linked. The psychological toll on the royal family was immense. Each disappearance left surviving members both fearful and inspired. Heirs understood that stepping onto the pilgrimage path meant risking life, sanity, and corporeal existence, yet refusal was inconceivable. It would be tantamount to relinquishing legitimacy. Letters, diaries, and oral histories record nights of sleepless anticipation, debates over preparedness, and private rituals intended to shield the monarch from unseen forces. Families would send symbolic offerings along the routes, hoping that ancestral blessings or the guidance of monks might influence the mountain's judgment. Despite these precautions, every journey carried the possibility of disappearance, creating a pervasive tension that shaped the psychology of the dynasty. Even in modern times, these stories continue to captivate explorers and historians alike. Attempts to map and traverse the original pilgrimage routes are met with extraordinary challenges. Glaciers shift, paths vanish, and sudden storms make progress nearly impossible. Many who attempt these treks report sensations of being watched, hearing distant chants, or witnessing phenomena that defy logical explanation. These modern experiences echo the historical accounts, suggesting that the mountain's influence endures, shaping perception, behavior, and legend. In this way, the disappearances of the Pilgrim Kings are not merely historical curiosities. They are living mysteries, continuing to challenge human understanding and imagination. Ultimately, the disappearances reveal a kingdom where human ambition, spiritual devotion, and the natural world were intertwined in ways that challenge conventional narratives of power and history. The mountains were more than setting. They were active agents, arbiters of fate, and keepers of secrets that transcended time. The vanishings were both cautionary and transformative, reminding rulers and observers alike that mastery over terrain, ritual, and human life was never absolute. In these lost journeys, the Himalayas asserted their dominion, leaving behind stories that continue to blur the boundary between history, myth, and the unknowable, and compelling us to ask a single chilling question. What truly lies beyond the clouds for those who dare to ascend? The mystery of the Pilgrim Kings reached its most confounding chapter with the introduction of coded journals and cryptic letters that surfaced centuries later, tucked away in the hidden corners of monasteries and private collections. These texts, written in a mixture of scripts, some recognizable, others entirely unfamiliar, appeared to document the king's thoughts, rituals, and observations during the most perilous stages of their journeys. Unlike formal chronicles or administrative records, these writings were intensely personal, often revealing doubts, fears, and glimpses of mystical experiences that the public was never meant to know. Their very existence raised unsettling questions. Why had these documents survived in secrecy, and what truths had been deliberately concealed from the outside world? One particularly intriguing journal belonged to a king whose disappearance remains one of the most notorious. The entries begin with meticulous descriptions of weather, terrain, and companions' behavior, but gradually shift into abstract reflections, philosophical musings, and symbolic language. Mountains become metaphors for human ambition, storms stand in for inner turmoil, and clouds obscure not only physical paths but the trajectory of destiny itself. Some scholars interpret these passages as evidence that the kings were acutely aware of the precarious nature of their authority, that ruling a kingdom was inseparable from navigating the unpredictable forces of the Himalayas. The journals suggest a consciousness finely attuned to both human and natural dynamics, blending observation, spirituality, and survival into a singular perspective. Several letters, addressed to monks or distant relatives, hint at secret knowledge obtained during the pilgrimage. They speak of hidden shrines, rituals performed under specific celestial alignments, and encounters with figures, perhaps spiritual guides, perhaps visions, whose identities are intentionally obscured. The language is deliberately coded, with metaphors layered upon metaphors, suggesting that even those who discovered the text centuries later could interpret only fragments of their meaning. Some passages imply that the mountains themselves were sentient observers, capable of judgment, correction, and instruction. One striking line reads, "The peaks have seen my fear and smiled. I shall see them again only if humility carries me." Scholars debate whether such statements should be read literally or symbolically, but the emotional weight is undeniable. The mountains were forces to be reckoned with, capable of altering the course of life and death. The journals also reveal moments of profound psychological strain. Kings described hallucinations, disorientation, and encounters with phenomena that seemed impossible. Footprints appearing without origin, whispered voices on the wind, and shadowy forms gliding across cliffsides. Some entries detail the acute physical toll, frostbite, exhaustion, altitude sickness, while others describe a sense of altered perception, where time, distance, and gravity appeared to warp. These descriptions are more than anecdotal. They suggest a holistic experience in which the body, mind, and spirit were tested simultaneously, and where survival depended on a rare synthesis of courage, intuition, and adaptability. What is perhaps most compelling about these texts is the ethical and spiritual dimension of the king's reflections. Beyond survival, the journals emphasize lessons in humility, justice, and the responsibilities of authority. Kings wrote of observing villages from high passes, noting human behaviors under stress and prosperity, and reflecting on their implications for governance. They describe how witnessing courage, compassion, or despair shaped their understanding of leadership and morality. These insights reveal a recurring theme. The pilgrimage was not merely a physical or spiritual trial. It was a form of governance in miniature, where observation, empathy, and discernment were tested against the harshest conditions imaginable. Some letters hint at conflicts within the monarchy itself. References to rival heirs, competing factions, and secret alliances suggest that the pilgrimage carried political as well as spiritual stakes. A king might have been challenged not only by nature but by human intrigue, whispers of sabotage, hidden traps along the route, or misinformation about weather and terrain. The combination of environmental peril and political tension magnified the risks, transforming each journey into a delicate balance of strategy, endurance, and intuition. The mountains became both arena and arbitrator, ensuring that only those capable of navigating both physical and political hazards would endure. The coded nature of these journals also raises the possibility of deliberately obscured knowledge. Some scholars speculate that certain entries contain instructions for rituals, locations of hidden relics, or sequences of steps meant to access sacred knowledge. Whether these instructions were spiritual, practical, or protective is unclear, but the implication is that the kings had access to wisdom deemed too potent or dangerous for general dissemination. The secrecy of the texts ensured that such knowledge would remain within the inner circle, preserved for future rulers who could meet the rigorous standards of discipline, understanding, and courage required to unlock it. Interestingly, the journals reflect moments of doubt, fear, and even resignation. In several passages, kings questioned the purpose of their journeys, the justice of their lineage, or the meaning of the mountain's silence. These moments humanize figures often portrayed as untouchable or superhuman. They reveal that the weight of tradition, expectation, and mortality pressed heavily on the rulers, and that the Himalayas were not only external challenges but mirrors reflecting internal conflicts. The mountains tested not just endurance but character, pushing kings to confront desires, insecurities, and moral dilemmas that no throne or court could adequately prepare them for. The discovery of these journals also complicates modern interpretations of the disappearances. They suggest that vanishings may not have been accidental. Some entries describe paths, rituals, or alignments that, if performed incorrectly, might result in being lost or permanently separated from the world below. This raises haunting possibilities. Were the kings victims of natural hazards alone, or did the mountains exact judgment for missteps in ritual, morality, or humility? The texts offer no definitive answer, instead leaving layers of ambiguity that continue to fuel debate, speculation, and fascination. In sum, the coded journals and letters are windows into a world where power, spirituality, and danger intertwined inextricably. They reveal rulers profoundly aware of their own limitations, deeply engaged with both human society and the natural world, and willing to risk everything in pursuit of understanding. The documents are haunting not simply because of what they describe, but because they hint at knowledge that has been lost, hidden, or deliberately obscured. A legacy that challenges historians, adventurers, and storytellers alike. Through these writings, the Pilgrim Kings continue to speak across centuries, inviting us to wonder, to fear, and to seek what may lie beyond the paths they once walked. Paths that vanish into the clouds, leaving only whispers of their passage and the enduring question: what became of those who dared to follow the mountain's secretive call? The tales surrounding the Pilgrim Kings' disappearances took on an almost supernatural aura over time, fueled not only by eyewitness accounts but by the testimonies of travelers, monks, and villagers who reported phenomena that defied rational explanation. In isolated valleys and high-altitude passes, the air seemed charged with a presence that could be felt rather than seen. Mists would descend without warning, thickening into ghostly veils that obscured paths and disoriented even the most experienced guides. Wind carried faint echoes of chanting, distant footsteps, or the sound of bells where no temple existed. Shadows moved along ridges and cliffs in ways that contradicted the sun, vanishing when approached, only to reappear elsewhere. These occurrences were consistent across generations, suggesting a force beyond simple coincidence, something embedded within the very fabric of the mountains themselves. Local folklore interpreted these events as the lingering presence of the king's spirits or as manifestations of the mountain's guardians, sentient forces charged with preserving sacred knowledge. Villagers spoke of the Watchers of the Clouds, invisible entities who monitored the actions of humans and, in some cases, intervened to maintain cosmic balance. Travelers who encountered these phenomena often reported a profound sense of being observed, their intentions laid bare by unseen eyes. Some even claimed that the mountains communicated through signs and symbols, shifting rocks, patterns in snowfall, or the behavior of animals, all of which carried warnings or guidance. For the pilgrim-kings, who were intimately familiar with these traditions, such signs were taken seriously, their interpretation forming a critical part of both survival and ritual. Monastic records amplify these accounts, describing incidents where kings approached perilous passes and were confronted with apparitions or visions that defied explanation. One chronicle recounts a monarch who, upon reaching a narrow ledge, saw figures in ceremonial robes moving in perfect synchronization along a ridge he had just crossed. The figures vanished when approached, leaving the king shaken yet convinced that he had witnessed a sacred phenomenon, a confirmation of his path or a test of his resolve. Another text details an encounter with a sudden storm that appeared localized to a single peak, its intensity and pattern so precise that the king and his guides were forced to retreat, interpreting it as a judgment from the mountains themselves. Such events reinforced the perception that the Himalayas were active participants in the king's journeys, not mere landscapes to be traversed but entities with agency and intention. These mysterious occurrences were often accompanied by subtle signs in the environment. Glacial crevices seemed to open and close with timing that defied natural observation. Footprints appeared in fresh snow only to vanish moments later, and distant avalanches sometimes occurred in ways that mirrored ritual sequences performed by the kings. Birds, wildlife, and even domestic animals reacted in unpredictable ways near sacred paths, refusing to cross certain areas or behaving erratically, as if aware of events invisible to human eyes. Scholars have speculated whether these phenomena were the result of complex ecological and meteorological patterns misinterpreted over generations. Yet the consistency and symbolic significance embedded in local narratives suggest a deliberate integration of natural and supernatural experience, blurring the boundaries between observation and belief. One particularly eerie aspect of these reports involves sound. Travelers consistently recounted hearing chanting, bells, or music emanating from locations where no physical source could exist. The phenomenon often coincided with the king's approach to specific shrines or thresholds, suggesting either an acoustic anomaly of the high mountains or, as the chronicles insist, a spiritual communication. The sounds were described as both distant and intimately near, at times echoing in the minds of the listeners rather than their ears. These experiences left a profound psychological impact, heightening awareness, caution, and reverence, while embedding an emotional resonance that would carry the events into legend. The interplay between fear and fascination was a defining element of these experiences. Pilgrim-kings reported heightened states of perception, moments in which the boundaries between the physical and spiritual seemed to dissolve. The mountains tested not only physical endurance but moral and spiritual fortitude. Kings were confronted with visions of mortality, warnings of hubris, and symbolic representations of potential futures. In some cases, the visions mirrored real dangers, avalanches, crevices, or hidden precipices, reinforcing the belief that the mountains themselves were teachers, guiding those who paid attention and punishing those who ignored their lessons. The psychological tension created by these phenomena was as significant as the physical dangers of high-altitude travel, shaping decisions, rituals, and the stories passed down to future generations. Interestingly, these mystical encounters often coincided with recorded disappearances. Patterns emerge in monastic records indicating that phenomena intensified near the points where kings later vanished or where search parties discovered nothing. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, mists thickened, and echoes of voices intensified, suggesting that the disappearances were not random but linked to specific spiritual or environmental conditions. Some historians interpret this as symbolic narrative, a way to encode lessons in caution, humility, and reverence for sacred spaces. Others entertain the possibility of forces or mechanisms beyond contemporary understanding, whether natural, psychological, or supernatural, which actively influenced the outcomes of the pilgrimage. The villagers' own rituals and responses reflect the depth of this perception. Offerings were left along paths, prayers chanted to appease unseen forces, and sacred markers erected to honor the mountain's authority. Guides accompanying the kings would often perform ceremonies at key junctures, interpreting changes in wind, snow, or animal behavior as signals. These practices indicate a sophisticated integration of empirical observation, cultural memory, and spiritual belief, revealing a society attuned to the complex dynamics of their environment. The mountains were not feared blindly. They were understood as partners in an ongoing dialogue between humanity and the natural spiritual world. Modern researchers attempting to retrace these routes encounter similar sensations, even if interpreted through contemporary scientific frameworks. Sudden weather shifts, unstable ice formations, and unexpected echoes still confound expectations. The stories of unseen watchers continue to resonate, reflecting both the enduring mystery of the peaks and the way human perception interacts with extreme environments. Whether interpreted as cultural memory, psychological response, or evidence of a more profound phenomenon, the accounts underscore the unique relationship the Pilgrim Kings had with the high Himalayas, a bond defined by reverence, fear, and a relentless search for understanding. Ultimately, the phenomena observed along the paths of the later Pilgrim Kings illustrate that these journeys were far more than physical expeditions. They were tests of the human spirit, exercises in perception, and encounters with forces that were both tangible and ineffable. Every mist, shadow, and echo reinforced the mountain's authority, shaping the king's behavior and guiding their decisions. The disappearances, the visions, and the inexplicable events are intertwined in a tapestry of mystery that challenges historians and adventurers alike. They compel us to reconsider what is known, to imagine what may lie beyond perception, and to acknowledge that some truths of the Himalayas, and of the Pilgrim Kings, remain forever obscured in cloud, snow, and legend. The Pilgrim Kings' journeys into the high Himalayas were not undertaken in solitude. Accompanying them were small entourages composed of trusted advisors, monks, guides, and sometimes family members. These companions served both practical and ceremonial roles, ensuring the king's survival while reinforcing the spiritual and political dimensions of the pilgrimage. Each individual had a defined place within the hierarchy of the expedition. Guides scouted treacherous paths and read environmental cues. Monks maintained rituals and interpreted omens, and attendants carried provisions and ceremonial items. The composition of the entourage reflected a delicate balance between protection, observance, and the need for spiritual focus. A microcosm of the kingdom itself, navigating both peril and purpose along the mountain's demanding routes. Guides were indispensable. Often natives of the high valleys themselves, they possessed unparalleled knowledge of passes, avalanches, hidden ledges, and seasonal hazards. Their expertise extended beyond geography into local lore, sacred sites, and subtle signs that indicated danger or blessing. A guide might notice a subtle discoloration in a snowfield signaling a hidden crevasse, hear a distant echo indicating shifting ice, or recognize animal behavior that presaged a storm. Without such interpreters of the land, the journey would have been impossible. Yet the guides themselves were vulnerable to the mountain's hazards. Many left behind tales of bravery, ingenuity, and tragedy. Their fates intertwined with the kings they served, reinforcing the high stakes of every expedition. Monks accompanying the pilgrimage fulfilled roles that were both spiritual and practical. They conducted prayers, maintained protective rituals, and interpreted the symbolism of signs in the terrain. Certain shrines could only be approached with precise ceremonial gestures, offerings, and chants, knowledge that the monks preserved across generations. Some kings relied heavily on these spiritual advisors, seeking guidance in moments of uncertainty or fear. Monks also recorded observations in their own journals, providing critical insight into the king's psychological states, interactions with the environment, and encounters with phenomena that were often extraordinary. Their meticulous documentation has allowed modern scholars to reconstruct the journeys with remarkable detail, despite the centuries that have passed. Family members, when present, added a layer of political and emotional complexity. Princes or heirs who accompanied the king gained first-hand experience of the pilgrimage's dangers and demands, a form of tutelage that extended beyond instruction in governance to an education in resilience, perception, and humility. Their presence reinforced continuity within the dynasty, ensuring that knowledge of the sacred routes, rituals, and hidden wisdom would pass to future generations. Yet the inclusion of family members also intensified the stakes. A misstep could mean not only the king's death but the loss of an heir, potentially destabilizing the kingdom itself. This delicate interplay of mentorship, risk, and succession imbued the pilgrimage with an urgency that transcended mere tradition. Interactions within the entourage were also revealing of the human condition under extreme stress. Exhaustion, altitude sickness, and environmental hazards heightened tensions, yet they also fostered profound bonds. Companions relied on one another for survival, interpreting subtle cues in behavior, offering encouragement, and making split-second decisions that could mean life or death. Accounts in monastic journals describe moments of selfless bravery, attendants carrying incapacitated monks across treacherous ice, guides leading the king along hidden ledges in whiteout conditions, or members sharing scarce provisions during storms. These episodes illustrate that the pilgrimage was not solely a trial for the king, but a crucible for all involved, demanding courage, resourcefulness, and unwavering commitment. The entourage's role extended to navigation of the mountain's mysterious phenomena. When strange shadows appeared, whispers carried on the wind, or sudden mists descended, companions played an interpretive role, often mediating between fear and action. Monks would counsel the king on the meaning of omens. Guides would assess the practical implications of sudden changes in terrain or weather. This collaborative approach was critical. The mountains presented challenges that were both literal and symbolic, requiring a unified response that balanced rational judgment with spiritual insight. Each member's contribution was essential in deciphering the mountain's coded language, a language that determined whether the expedition would succeed or succumb to the peak's indifferent power. The bonds within the entourage also carried ethical and emotional weight. Witnessing the king's vulnerability or spiritual strain demanded loyalty, empathy, and discretion. Many journals recount moments when companions made decisions to protect the king from despair or to conceal knowledge that could disrupt the psychological balance of the journey. These dynamics illustrate a complex moral landscape. The pilgrimage was as much about internal navigation, managing fear, ambition, and temptation as external survival. Each choice carried consequences, not only for immediate safety but for the continuity of the monarchy and the integrity of sacred tradition. Conflicts sometimes arose within these groups. Differences in interpretation of signs, strategic priorities, or personal ambition occasionally created tension. Monastic advisors might clash with guides over whether a path was safe. Attendants might question decisions that endangered their lives. Yet these conflicts were often resolved through ritualized consultation, consensus, or deference to sacred precedent. The process itself reinforced the pilgrimage's broader lessons. Authority was tempered by collaboration, insight by humility, and survival by recognition of forces beyond human control. The composition and interactions of the entourage underscore a critical dimension of the pilgrim-kings' journeys. The pilgrimage was not solely the king's test, but a collective trial that integrated leadership, loyalty, spiritual acumen, and survival skills. Success depended on the harmony between individuals, their capacity to interpret both visible and invisible forces, and their resilience under conditions that exceeded ordinary human experience. The entourage transformed the pilgrimage from a solitary endeavor into a living system of interdependent roles, each reinforcing the others while navigating the intricate interplay of the mountain's tangible and mystical challenges. Ultimately, these companions were witnesses, intermediaries, and participants in the shaping of legend. They ensured that the knowledge, rituals, and experiences of the kings were transmitted, recorded, and preserved, even as some members of the royal line vanished into the clouds. Through their eyes, we glimpse not only the perilous grandeur of the Himalayas, but the human heart under trial, courage, devotion, loyalty, and fear intertwined on paths that wind through mist, snow, and the enduring mysteries of the peaks. Each member of the entourage contributed to the narrative, their presence amplifying both the drama and the sacred resonance of the Pilgrim Kings' extraordinary journeys. The mountains of the Himalayas are ancient, silent witnesses to countless human dramas, and for the Pilgrim Kings, they were far more than imposing landscapes. They were active participants in shaping destiny. Beyond the physical challenges of altitude, frost, and treacherous terrain, these peaks held secrets that could alter the trajectory of kingdoms and the fate of those who dared to traverse them. It was said among the monks and villagers that certain ridges were imbued with energies older than recorded history, corridors where the veil between the mortal realm and forces beyond human comprehension was thinnest. Pilgrim kings who approached these areas reported sensations that defied explanation. Sudden clarity, visions of distant valleys they had never seen, or the perception of voices articulating guidance, warning, or judgment. The mountains demanded more than endurance. They demanded receptivity, humility, and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. Legends speak of hidden sanctuaries carved into cliffs, only accessible when snow and mist aligned in precise patterns dictated by the mountains themselves. Some were simple stone shelters. Others contained intricate carvings, ritual implements, and texts preserved over centuries. Pilgrim kings who discovered these sanctuaries often recorded cryptic notes, coded references to rituals, philosophical reflections, and accounts of spiritual encounters. These writings suggest that the mountains offered lessons as much as they posed threats, guiding rulers toward wisdom through direct and indirect trials. Accessing such sanctuaries was considered both a privilege and a peril. For each discovery, a king risked losing his way, or in some accounts, never returning. The mystical geography of the Himalayas added layers of complexity to every journey. Weather patterns shifted abruptly, with storms materializing over single peaks while valleys remained clear. Avalanches could bury paths within minutes. Glaciers groaned with movements that threatened to swallow unwary travelers. And sudden fog concealed chasms that could end a pilgrimage in an instant. Observant kings and their entourages learned to interpret these natural phenomena as signs, subtle warnings that required immediate response, or markers of spiritual significance. A broken branch, a disturbed flock of birds, or the faint scent of burning incense lingering in a windless morning could all carry meaning. Survival depended as much on perceptive interpretation as on physical skill, forging a deep connection between human intuition and the natural world. The high passes were also spaces of profound psychological challenge. Isolation, altitude, and exhaustion exerted relentless pressure on the mind. Pilgrim kings recorded episodes where time seemed to dilate, distances appeared distorted, and ordinary sounds transformed into voices or chants. Shadows shifted unnaturally. Snow and ice reflected light in ways that made the familiar strange and the distant near. Some chroniclers interpreted these experiences as spiritual trials designed by the mountains themselves, shaping the king's perception and judgment. Others regarded them as extreme manifestations of physical and mental strain. Regardless of interpretation, the impact on decision-making, ritual practice, and interpersonal dynamics within the entourage was profound. Encounters with hermits, shamans, and other isolated figures added another layer to the complexity of these journeys. These individuals often acted as interpreters of the mountain's signs, performing rituals to ensure safe passage or offering insight into obscure phenomena. Yet their knowledge was not freely given. It was earned through patience, deference, and demonstration of understanding. Kings recorded these encounters in their personal journals, noting lessons on humility, endurance, and the interplay between human will and environmental forces. In many cases, these lessons became embedded in governance practices, influencing how rulers negotiated disputes, allocated resources, and maintained moral authority back in their kingdoms. The peaks also served as repositories of collective memory and cautionary history. Carvings, shrines, and scattered artifacts marked the sites of previous pilgrimages, some of which ended in tragedy. Avalanche scars, frozen relics, and abandoned campsites reminded future travelers of the dangers inherent to the terrain. Monks often interpreted these remnants as both warnings and moral instruction. Hubris, neglect, or inattention to subtle signs could lead to catastrophe. Kings internalized these lessons, developing an acute awareness of vulnerability and the importance of observation, adaptability, and respect for forces beyond immediate comprehension. Trade and communication routes winding through these high regions further amplified the stakes. Caravans carrying salt, precious metals, and exotic goods traversed the same passes, often coinciding with pilgrimages. Kings traveling these routes observed not only the logistical challenges of supply but the resilience and ingenuity of local communities. They noted how villages adapted to seasonal isolation, how traders read weather patterns and avalanche risks, and how knowledge of sacred geography intersected with survival strategies. These observations reinforced the notion that rulership was inseparable from lived experience, with every decision informed by an understanding of both human society and the natural world. The mountains were also theaters for moral and ethical testing. Kings witnessed courage, sacrifice, and compassion in their entourages and among villagers, as well as fear, despair, and betrayal. These observations shaped governance, offering insight into human behavior under extreme stress. A king who failed to understand these dynamics risked not only physical failure on the journey but also misjudgment in leadership. The mountains thus functioned as both training ground and moral compass, imparting lessons that extended far beyond the peaks themselves. Yet despite the danger and uncertainty, the peaks inspired awe. Sunlight scattering across jagged ridges, clouds swirling in patterns that suggested movement and intention, and the silent majesty of glaciers imbued the landscape with a sense of the sublime. Pilgrim kings often paused to meditate, sketch, or document these impressions, blending practical knowledge with spiritual reflection. These moments of quiet observation were integral to the journey, allowing insight, integration, and perspective that were as critical to survival and leadership as any practical skill. Ultimately, the mountains of the Himalayas were not passive backdrops. They were active, sentient forces shaping the pilgrim king's experiences, decisions, and legacies. Every ridge, glacier, and sacred sanctuary contributed to the education of rulers, testing endurance, intuition, morality, and courage. The peaks imparted lessons in ways both tangible and mystical, reminding kings that authority was inseparable from understanding, humility, and the capacity to navigate forces far beyond human control. The experiences gained in these high places became the bedrock of wisdom, strategy, and legend, forging leaders who were intimately attuned to both the tangible and intangible currents of their world. The pilgrimage across these peaks was thus a journey into the heart of both the Himalayas and the human spirit, a relentless, transformative passage where danger, revelation, and awe coexisted in every step. Through the mountains, the kings learned to balance authority with humility, observation with action, and fear with courage, shaping a dynasty that would become immortalized not only for its political might but for its extraordinary communion with the living, mysterious, and uncompromising peaks of the world's highest mountains. The legend of the Pilgrim Kings is inseparable from the secretive rituals they performed along their journeys. Rituals that were carefully designed to harmonize the human with the divine, the mortal with the eternal. These ceremonies were seldom recorded in official chronicles. They were guarded knowledge, passed orally from one king to the next, from one monk to another, and embedded within the subtle markings and signs hidden along the pilgrimage routes. Some rituals involved offerings at hidden shrines high above the valleys. Others required precise alignment with the sun, moon, and stars. There were chants whose vibrations were believed to awaken protective forces within the mountains, gestures intended to appease spirits, and symbolic acts that echoed ancestral agreements with the peaks themselves. Participation was not optional. Missteps could bring misfortune, or, as some texts imply, permanent disappearance. The rituals were simultaneously spiritual, political, and practical, serving to guide the kings, legitimize their rule, and maintain balance between human ambition and the natural world. Certain rituals involved the use of objects imbued with significance. Carved staffs, ceremonial robes, amulets, and scrolls that contained coded instructions. Each object had a prescribed place and sequence of use, often known only to the king and his most trusted advisors. Monks accompanying the kings meticulously documented these actions, sometimes in allegorical language, ensuring the preservation of knowledge while shielding it from outsiders. One particularly enigmatic record describes a sequence in which a king placed a series of small stones along a ridge, each representing a virtue: courage, humility, patience, before offering incense to the wind. The act itself, while physically simple, was believed to synchronize the king's intentions with forces within the mountains, creating a form of spiritual navigation that complemented the physical challenges of the journey. Pilgrim kings also engaged in rituals designed to test their perception and discernment. Hidden markers, coded symbols, and subtle environmental cues required careful observation, intuition, and trust in guidance from companions. For example, an unusually twisted tree, a specific formation of clouds, or the direction of falling snow might indicate the correct path or signal a hidden hazard. These practices were both practical and symbolic, training kings to read the mountains as a living text, a form of literacy that encompassed landscape, climate, ritual, and the unseen. The intertwining of observation and ceremony reinforced the idea that survival and enlightenment were inseparable, that mastery over one's environment demanded harmony with both the tangible and the mysterious. The psychological and spiritual dimensions of these rituals were profound. Kings reported altered states of consciousness during certain ceremonies, moments in which time seemed to dilate, and their awareness expanded beyond the ordinary senses. Some described visions of past rulers, guardians of the peaks, or celestial patterns that seemed to communicate guidance, warning, or prophecy. These experiences were interpreted as confirmation of the king's alignment with the mountain's rhythms, a sign that the human mind and spirit were attuned to forces that shaped destiny itself. The rituals, therefore, were not merely symbolic. They were instruments of perception, sharpening intuition, moral clarity, and insight in ways that would later inform leadership, strategy, and governance. The interplay between secrecy and observation was critical. Pilgrim kings were often accompanied by trusted entourages, but the execution of certain rituals required solitude or selective presence. A single misstep, a breach of protocol, or the presence of uninitiated observers could nullify the ceremony's power, invite misfortune, or reveal vulnerabilities. This tension heightened the stakes, fostering a profound awareness of responsibility and precision in every action. Monks and advisors provided guidance, but ultimately the king was responsible for executing the rituals correctly, balancing respect for tradition with personal discernment. The risk and discipline involved in these ceremonies contributed to the mystique of the pilgrimage, reinforcing the perception that only those worthy and prepared could emerge unscathed. Rituals also reinforced ethical and moral lessons, serving as allegorical tests of character. A king might be required to distribute scarce provisions to a group of wandering pilgrims or to remain still for hours in contemplation atop a freezing ridge. These acts were not merely exercises in endurance. They were tests of patience, empathy, humility, and resilience. Success in ritual practice was seen as evidence of spiritual and moral alignment, reinforcing legitimacy in the eyes of both the mountains and the human communities below. Failure, conversely, carried consequences that were immediate, psychological, or, in some cases, permanent. The mountains themselves became the final arbiter, shaping destiny through trial, observation, and the subtle orchestration of challenge and reward. Beyond the individual, these rituals also had collective significance. Villagers, monks, and remote communities often participated indirectly, maintaining shrines, performing supporting ceremonies, and offering guidance to the king and entourage. The pilgrimage thus became a social as well as spiritual enterprise, weaving together networks of trust, knowledge, and shared responsibility. The mountains were central to this network, mediating interactions between human actors, sacred practices, and the environment in a delicate balance that sustained both the ritual framework and the authority of the monarchy. The secretive nature of the rituals also fueled speculation and myth-making. Outsiders rarely witnessed the ceremonies directly, and accounts were often veiled in allegory or symbolism. This secrecy preserved the sanctity and potency of the practices but also amplified their mystique. Travelers, chroniclers, and later historians pieced together fragments, creating narratives that straddled history, folklore, and legend. The result is a body of knowledge that is simultaneously tantalizing and elusive, one that invites curiosity while maintaining an air of sacred inaccessibility, much like the mountains themselves. Ultimately, the rituals of the Pilgrim Kings were a microcosm of the entire pilgrimage, a delicate interplay of human skill, moral fortitude, spiritual awareness, and attunement to the mountain's forces. They demanded mastery over both self and environment, offering lessons in leadership, endurance, and the subtle dynamics of power. Through these ceremonies, kings aligned themselves with principles larger than political authority, connecting mortal life with the enduring rhythms of the natural and spiritual worlds. The rites were transformative, shaping character, forging resilience, and reinforcing the enigmatic bond between human and mountain, a bond that would define the legacy of the Pilgrim Kings for centuries to come. These sacred practices were not static. They evolved over generations, incorporating new insights, adaptations to environmental shifts, and reflections on previous successes or failures. Each king added layers of understanding, codifying experience into ritual while maintaining its esoteric core. In this way, the pilgrimage became a living tradition, simultaneously preserving ancient wisdom and adapting to contemporary challenges, ensuring that each journey remained both perilous and enlightening, a true test of body, mind, and spirit against the indomitable power of the Himalayas. As the Pilgrim Kings ascended into the highest reaches of the Himalayas, they entered a domain where the ordinary laws of nature seemed to bend and conventional understanding faltered. Here, the mountains were no longer simply formidable terrain. They became an active force, testing the limits of human endurance, perception, and morality. Snowfields stretched endlessly, glaciers groaned with hidden movements, and sheer cliffs loomed with the ever-present threat of misstep. At these altitudes, oxygen was scarce, temperatures could drop to deadly extremes, and visibility was frequently reduced by sudden mists or storms. Every decision carried consequences of life and death. But beyond the physical dangers, the mountains imposed psychological and spiritual trials that were as exacting as any cliff or crevasse. Pilgrim Kings reported moments when reality itself seemed altered. Time dilated, distances became deceptive, and shadows appeared to move independently of their sources. These experiences were recorded in journals with a sense of awe and trepidation, suggesting that the mountains possessed a consciousness, or at least a force that interacted directly with human intent. This stage of the pilgrimage demanded absolute discipline from the king and his entourage. Guides scouted ahead, interpreting subtle environmental cues, changes in snow texture, the movement of wildlife, or the orientation of clouds could indicate hidden dangers or paths of least resistance. Monks performed rituals at key junctures, chanting prayers and invoking protective forces to safeguard against both natural and metaphysical hazards. The rituals were not symbolic alone. Many kings believed that the correct performance of ceremonies could influence the mountains themselves, mitigating peril or granting insight. In this way, physical preparation and spiritual observance were inseparable. Survival required mastery over body, mind, and spirit, a triad of skills honed over years of tradition and practice. At these dizzying heights, hallucinations, both auditory and visual, became a common experience. Some kings reported seeing figures in ceremonial attire moving along ridges or across glaciers, only to vanish when approached. Voices echoed in ways that seemed to originate both within and beyond the mountains, often delivering cryptic warnings or guidance. While modern interpretations might suggest altitude-induced delirium, historical accounts treat these phenomena as real and consequential, shaping decisions and influencing the outcomes of entire expeditions. The king's journals hint at a dual awareness, recognizing the natural explanation while simultaneously accepting a spiritual or metaphysical interpretation, a balancing act that became a hallmark of Himalayan pilgrimage. One of the most critical challenges of this stage was the negotiation of high-altitude passes that were both physically treacherous and symbolically charged. Certain ridges, glaciers, or cliff faces were considered liminal spaces, thresholds between the known and the unknown, life and death, mortal and divine. Pilgrim kings approached these areas with ritual preparation, often leaving offerings or performing gestures intended to harmonize their intent with the forces of the peaks. Success required not only physical skill but moral clarity and attentiveness. Missteps could result in immediate danger, disorientation, or, in some accounts, permanent disappearance. These thresholds served as ultimate tests of character, filtering out those unprepared for the journey's final revelations. The entourage played a crucial role in these high-altitude trials. Guides remained vigilant, constantly scanning for subtle signs of shifting snow, hidden crevasses, or unstable ice formations. Monks interpreted environmental cues as omens or spiritual messages, advising the king on the appropriate timing for steps, pauses, or rituals. Attendants and family members provided practical support, ensuring that provisions were rationed and companions were protected against exposure. The dynamics within the group were delicate. Tension, fear, and exhaustion could escalate quickly, yet cohesion and mutual trust were essential. Every action and decision carried amplified weight, and the collective wisdom of the entourage often proved decisive in determining survival. At these heights, encounters with spiritual or mystical phenomena intensified. Pilgrim-kings recorded visions of ancestors, celestial alignments, and figures that seemed to guide, admonish, or test their resolve. Some described hearing chants emanating from unseen shrines or witnessing clouds forming shapes that conveyed messages. Others encountered sudden openings in snow or ice that revealed hidden altars or artifacts, only visible under precise conditions of light and weather. Such experiences were interpreted as confirmations of the king's alignment with spiritual law, tests of humility, and opportunities to gain insight unavailable to those unprepared. They reinforced the notion that the pilgrimage was not merely a physical journey but a profound exercise in perception, ethics, and spiritual attunement. Environmental hazards remained relentless. Avalanches could strike without warning. Blizzards disoriented even seasoned guides, and hidden crevices threatened instant catastrophe. Pilgrim-kings' journals frequently recount moments where survival depended on split-second decisions informed by a combination of experience, intuition, and spiritual guidance. These high-altitude passages also demanded endurance beyond the ordinary. Hours spent in near-zero temperatures, navigating ice-laden ledges, or crossing frozen rivers required not only strength but meticulous attention to technique. The mountains allowed no lapse in vigilance. Even minor errors could result in fatal consequences. The psychological impact of these extreme conditions was profound. Isolation, thin air, and relentless environmental stress induced moments of fear, doubt, and despair. Kings reflected on mortality, the impermanence of power, and the fragile nature of human life. Some accounts describe meditative states in which clarity and insight arose amidst hardship, moments when vision, intuition, and moral judgment converged. These experiences forged resilience, sharpened leadership skills, and deepened spiritual understanding. The mountains served as both crucible and teacher, revealing the limits of human endurance while providing lessons that transcended the physical realm. Political stakes were also present, even at the highest altitudes. Rival factions, succession concerns, and the need to legitimize authority infused every step with weight beyond survival. Kings were aware that failure, visible to trusted companions or recorded in coded journals, could undermine credibility and diminish their lineage's influence. The pilgrimage, therefore, was simultaneously a test of governance, judgment, and personal fortitude, with the mountains serving as an impartial arbiter of readiness and capability. Ultimately, the high-altitude stages of the pilgrimage exemplified the full integration of physical, spiritual, and ethical trials. Success required the careful coordination of observation, ritual, endurance, and discernment. The final stages of the pilgrimage carried the pilgrim-kings into the most remote, unforgiving reaches of the Himalayas, where the thin air, extreme cold, and treacherous terrain created a world both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Here, the mountains revealed themselves in full grandeur. Jagged peaks that pierced the clouds, glaciers that groaned and shifted like living creatures, and snowfields so vast that they seemed endless. Survival required more than physical strength. It demanded attunement to the rhythm of the mountains, an ability to read subtle signs, and unwavering focus. Even experienced guides noted that familiar landmarks could vanish overnight beneath fresh snow, and that winds carried deceptive echoes that made direction difficult to discern. Every step became a negotiation with forces beyond human control, a constant balance between caution and resolve, intuition and action. At these extreme altitudes, the interplay of environment, ritual, and perception reached its zenith. The kings and their entourages engaged in ceremonies designed to maintain alignment with the peak's hidden currents. Offerings at cliffside shrines, chants timed to the movement of the sun and stars, and symbolic acts that echoed generations of pilgrimage. Monks and spiritual advisors interpreted omens with meticulous care, their guidance often determining the route taken, the timing of pauses, or the execution of protective rituals. These practices were more than superstition. They were frameworks for survival, honed over centuries of observation, integrating human behavior, natural phenomena, and spiritual insight into a single, coherent approach to navigating an environment that was as lethal as it was majestic. The psychological and emotional intensity of this stage was unparalleled. Exhaustion, oxygen deprivation, and isolation brought heightened awareness, hallucinations, and altered perceptions. Kings reported seeing shadows in impossible places, hearing voices carried on the wind, or glimpsing figures in ceremonial attire that seemed to guide or admonish them. Some accounts describe visions of ancestors, guardians of the mountains, or symbolic representations of fate. These experiences were not mere fantasy. They influenced decisions, prompted ritual acts, and reinforced the perception that the mountains were sentient and morally engaged, capable of both testing and rewarding those who traversed their heights. Survival at this altitude also depended on meticulous attention to environmental cues. Snowdrifts could conceal deadly crevasses, glaciers shifted unpredictably, and high winds could strip heat and orientation in minutes. Guides were critical, interpreting subtle signs, the color and texture of ice, the behavior of birds or wildlife, and shifts in cloud formations that signaled sudden storms. Monks observed atmospheric phenomena, animal behavior, and symbolic alignments, advising kings on the timing of travel, pauses, or ritual action. Each individual's skill, vigilance, and judgment became amplified, with consequences that were immediate and severe. The mountains demanded cooperation, wisdom, and respect, qualities that determined both survival and spiritual advancement. One of the most enigmatic features of this stage involved the occurrence of vanishing zones, areas where travelers, even in groups, could inexplicably lose their way or disappear entirely. Historical records suggest that these zones were associated with unusual weather patterns, optical illusions caused by light reflecting off ice, and subtle shifts in topography that confused even the most experienced guides. Chroniclers interpreted these disappearances as a combination of natural hazard and spiritual consequence. Areas where the mountains tested humility, moral alignment, or readiness to face ultimate truths. The lore surrounding these zones was both cautionary and mystical, emphasizing that mastery of the peaks required not only physical skill but ethical integrity, attentiveness, and spiritual attunement. Interactions with local hermits, reclusive shamans, and isolated villagers became increasingly critical. These individuals often acted as intermediaries between human travelers and the mountain's hidden currents, providing guidance, ritual insight, and interpretation of environmental or mystical signals. Access to their knowledge was contingent upon humility, patience, and careful observation. Missteps could lead to disfavor, misguidance, or even heightened danger. These encounters underscore the dual nature of the pilgrimage. Practical survival was inseparable from moral and spiritual discernment, and the mountains themselves seemed to reward alignment with both external and internal principles. Ethical tests intensified in these final stages. Pilgrim kings were confronted with dilemmas that combined physical risk and moral responsibility. Decisions about whether to assist a struggling companion, how to ration dwindling provisions, or whether to advance despite clear signs of hazard had immediate consequences. Monastic guidance, combined with careful observation of the environment, often dictated the correct course, but ultimate responsibility rested with the king. The mountains functioned as impartial adjudicators. Mistakes could be fatal, whereas correct decisions reinforced authority, integrity, and the king's alignment with the sacred order of the peaks. Amidst the danger, moments of profound revelation occurred. Sunlight breaking through storm clouds illuminated hidden ridges or sacred altars, offering glimpses of symbolic significance. Frozen rivers and glaciers revealed layers of geological history that mirrored philosophical insights, and patterns in the snow, rock, or wind could suggest alignment with long-standing traditions or spiritual truths. Kings often paused to meditate, record observations, or perform ritual acts that fused environmental awareness with spiritual reflection. These moments reinforced the dual purpose of the pilgrimage: to endure and to understand, to traverse and to interpret, to confront mortality while accessing insight that extended beyond the mortal realm. Physical endurance at this stage was tested in ways that bordered on the extraordinary. Hours spent navigating exposed ledges, crossing glaciers, or wading through violent storms demanded unwavering focus, precise technique, and coordination among companions. Hypothermia, frostbite, and altitude sickness were constant threats, magnified by exhaustion and psychological strain. The mountains offered no margin for error. Every misstep could result in injury or death. Yet, for those who persevered, the rewards extended beyond mere survival. Clarity of perception, mastery over fear, and the deepening of wisdom acquired through hardship. The final high-altitude regions also emphasized the interplay between observation, ritual, and legacy. Kings meticulously documented their routes, experiences, and encounters, often encoding knowledge in symbolic language, markings, or ceremonial sequences. These records ensured that future generations could benefit from the accumulated wisdom, even as some of the most secretive or dangerous passages remained cloaked in mystery. The ultimate high-altitude plateaus of the Himalayas represented the final crucible for the pilgrim-kings, a realm where the mountain's formidable beauty masked lethal danger. At these elevations, the air thinned to a near imperceptible breath, and the cold penetrated even the most insulating garments. Glaciers stretched like frozen rivers of silver, interspersed with hidden crevasses capable of swallowing a man whole. Winds howled with a voice that seemed almost sentient, bending snow and ice into patterns that disoriented both body and mind. For the kings, survival here was not simply a matter of endurance. It was an exercise in perception, intuition, and spiritual alignment. Every ridge, every pass, every shadow carried both a warning and a lesson. One misjudged step could result in death, while careful observation could yield insight as profound as any gained in councils or courts far below. At these altitudes, the line between physical and metaphysical experience blurred completely. Kings and their entourages described phenomena that defied rational explanation. Sudden mists that revealed hidden shrines, shadows that seemed to mirror or anticipate movement, and whispers that carried messages of guidance, warning, or judgment. Many chroniclers interpreted these experiences as the mountains themselves testing the king's courage, discernment, and alignment with the sacred order. Monks maintained that the peaks were sentient entities, aware of intention and capable of rewarding virtue or punishing hubris. From the perspective of survival, these events were as significant as any crevasse or icefall, influencing decision-making and the execution of rituals that could determine life or death. The physical trials at this stage were unparalleled. Thin air, freezing temperatures, and treacherous terrain combined to challenge even the most experienced guides and attendants. Every movement required precision. Stepping on solid ice rather than brittle snow, avoiding snowdrifts concealing crevices, and reading subtle changes in wind and light that indicated approaching storms. Exhaustion was relentless, and altitude sickness manifested in dizziness, confusion, and hallucination. The entourage relied on strict discipline, careful pacing, and vigilant observation, knowing that error could have immediate fatal consequences. In these moments, leadership was tested not only through strategic decision-making but through empathy, morale, and the ability to inspire courage under extreme duress. Rituals performed at these heights carried extraordinary significance. Offerings at hidden altars, chants synchronized with celestial alignments, and symbolic gestures performed with meticulous care were believed to harmonize the king's intent with the mountain's hidden forces. These acts were both practical and spiritual. They reinforced focus, provided psychological reassurance, and, according to tradition, influenced environmental conditions. A sudden clearing in a storm, the appearance of a safe path, or the discovery of a previously hidden shrine was often interpreted as a direct result of correct ritual practice. Monks and advisors documented these interactions with care, blending observation of natural phenomena with spiritual interpretation to guide future pilgrims. The final stages were also tests of character. The kings faced moral dilemmas amplified by extreme conditions: whether to assist a companion weakened by frostbite, how to ration limited provisions, or whether to continue along an uncertain path despite visible signs of danger. Every decision had immediate consequences, reinforcing the notion that leadership was inseparable from ethical discernment. Monks often mediated these decisions, interpreting environmental cues as omens or moral tests, while guides and attendants provided practical counsel. The mountains, impartial and formidable, judged both action and intent, rewarding those who aligned skill, courage, and virtue. Encounters with isolated figures, hermits, shamans, and long-dwelling locals, intensified at this stage. These individuals offered insight into hidden paths, spiritual interpretation, and the execution of critical rituals. Access to their guidance required humility, patience, and acute observation. Missteps could nullify any advantage or invite danger. Such interactions reinforced the broader theme of the pilgrimage. Survival, understanding, and legacy were intertwined with moral and spiritual alignment, and the mountains were the ultimate arbiter of both. High-altitude zones were also sites of vanishing events, where pilgrims reportedly disappeared without trace. Chroniclers recorded these occurrences with a combination of fear and reverence. Factors included extreme weather, optical illusions, treacherous ice, and sudden disorientation, but tradition interpreted these disappearances as the mountain's judgment on the unprepared, the arrogant, or the ethically compromised. These areas were treated with both caution and respect, their peril serving as a final lesson in humility, attentiveness, and reverence for the forces that governed both nature and human destiny. Despite the relentless danger, the peaks inspired profound awe and reflection. Sunlight fractured across glaciers, illuminating hidden altars and rock formations. Storm clouds sculpted shifting patterns in snow and ice that seemed almost intentional. Pilgrim kings paused to meditate, document, or perform ritual acts, blending practical navigation with spiritual reflection. These moments revealed that the mountains were simultaneously adversary and teacher, their grandeur offering insight into the delicate interplay between mortality, leadership, and cosmic order. The culmination of these trials was the ultimate assessment of endurance, moral fortitude, and perceptive skill. Each ridge crossed, crevasse navigated, or decision made reinforced lessons that extended beyond the mountains themselves. Kings who survived these stages emerged transformed, having integrated physical mastery, ethical discernment, and spiritual attunement. Those who failed became legends or cautionary tales, disappearing into the clouds or leaving behind only cryptic records of their final steps. Ultimately, the high plateaus embodied the essence of the pilgrimage, a fusion of risk, revelation, and instruction. The mountains tested not only the body but the mind, spirit, and ethical resolve. Every step, observation, and ritual acted as a measure of character, preparing the kings for leadership, legacy, and the sacred responsibilities that awaited beyond the peaks. The final high-altitude zones were both an endpoint and a threshold, a place where mortal endeavor met the transcendent, and where the pilgrim king's courage, wisdom, and integrity were immortalized in legend, etched into the very landscape they traversed. The culmination of the pilgrim king's journey brought them to the extreme edges of the Himalayas, where the air thins to almost nothing, the sun strikes with a blinding intensity, and the snow stretches endlessly in every direction. Here, the mountains are no longer mere obstacles but omnipresent forces, shaping experience through peril, beauty, and mystery. Each step required careful calculation. A single misjudged movement could mean plunging into a hidden crevasse or being swept away by a sudden avalanche. The physical danger was relentless, but it was inseparable from mental and spiritual trials. The kings and their companions reported moments when reality seemed to warp. Distances contracted or stretched, shadows moved independently, and distant sounds carried messages that were impossible to locate. These conditions tested not only endurance but perception, intuition, and courage, demanding complete attunement to both environment and self. At this ultimate stage, the interplay of ritual, observation, and intuition reached its zenith. Kings performed sacred acts at hidden altars or along specific ridges, guided by monks who interpreted celestial alignments, weather patterns, and subtle environmental cues. Offerings were made with meticulous precision, chants were timed to the movement of the sun and moon, and gestures followed traditions passed down through generations. These acts served multiple purposes. They reinforced psychological focus, maintained group cohesion, and, according to legend, influenced the forces of the mountains themselves. Some accounts describe sudden clearings in storms or the discovery of previously hidden paths immediately following the completion of these rituals, reinforcing the belief that spiritual alignment and environmental mastery were intertwined. The psychological strain at these heights was profound. Hypoxia, exhaustion, isolation, and continuous exposure to extreme conditions induced hallucinations, auditory distortions, and altered perceptions of time. Kings reported seeing figures who seemed both human and ethereal, hearing voices or chants that provided guidance or warning, and glimpsing patterns in the ice and snow that carried symbolic meaning. These experiences, recorded in journals with awe and reverence, reinforced the sense that the mountains were active participants, capable of testing resolve, rewarding insight, and revealing truths inaccessible to ordinary perception. Such encounters demanded discernment. Kings had to distinguish between illusion, intuition, and genuine spiritual insight to make decisions with real consequences. Physical hazards were compounded by the treacherous nature of the terrain itself. Snowfields concealed crevasses that could swallow a man in an instant. Glaciers shifted unpredictably, and rock faces, slick with ice, offered little purchase. Storms could erupt without warning, reducing visibility to mere feet and forcing the entourage to halt or retreat. Every movement required vigilance, careful planning, and cooperation among the group. Guides constantly monitored the environment, interpreting subtle cues such as changes in wind, ice texture, or wildlife behavior, while monks performed protective rituals and advised on the timing of progress. Leadership was tested not only through decision-making but through the ability to inspire calm, courage, and focus in companions facing mortal risk. This stage also brought ethical and moral challenges into stark relief. Decisions regarding companions' welfare, rationing of scarce supplies, and the choice to advance or retreat carried immediate life or death consequences. Pilgrim kings were forced to act with both courage and compassion, balancing personal ambition with responsibility for the safety of others. Monks and advisors provided guidance, often interpreting natural phenomena as signs or moral tests, yet ultimate accountability rested on the king. The mountains acted as impartial arbiters, rewarding those aligned with courage, wisdom, and ethical judgment, while punishing misjudgment, hubris, or negligence. Encounters with reclusive figures, hermits, shamans, or local sages, were more frequent and critical than ever. These individuals provided insight into hidden passages, spiritual alignment, and ritual precision. Access to such guidance required humility, attentiveness, and moral integrity. Missteps could nullify the benefit or introduce danger. These interactions emphasized a fundamental principle of the pilgrimage. Survival, understanding, and spiritual insight were inseparable, and the mountain's favor was contingent upon ethical and perceptive alignment. The final high-altitude plateaus were also the stage for vanishing events, areas where pilgrims reportedly disappeared without trace. These phenomena were often linked to sudden storms, optical illusions, treacherous ice, or disorientation, but tradition interpreted them as the mountain's ultimate tests. Disappearance could signify failure in perception, ethics, or spiritual attunement, serving as cautionary tales for future generations. Surviving these zones required a synthesis of physical skill, psychological resilience, moral discernment, and spiritual alignment, the culmination of lessons learned throughout the pilgrimage. Amidst these trials, moments of sublime beauty punctuated the danger. Sunlight fractured across glaciers, revealing hidden altars, carved stones, and secret paths. Storm clouds sculpted dynamic landscapes, casting shadows and light in patterns that seemed intentional, almost communicative. Pilgrim kings paused to meditate, document, and perform ritual acts, merging practical survival with spiritual reflection. These moments underscored the duality of the journey: danger and revelation, trial and insight, mortality and transcendence. The mountains tested the body, refined the mind, and expanded the spirit. The final stage also reinforced the concept of legacy. Kings meticulously documented the journey, encoding knowledge of paths, rituals, and environmental phenomena to guide future pilgrims. These records, often cryptic or symbolic, ensured the preservation of sacred knowledge while protecting its secrecy. The pilgrimage thus transcended the individual, linking past, present, and future through the mountains' enduring presence and the wisdom of those who navigated them successfully. Ultimately, the extreme high-altitude stages of the pilgrimage epitomized the integration of endurance, ethics, perception, and spiritual attunement. The mountains were both adversary and teacher, shaping the pilgrim king's leadership, judgment, and moral character. Only those capable of harmonizing physical skill, mental acuity, and ethical and spiritual insight could survive and emerge transformed. The peaks were a final arbiter, exacting the ultimate test of courage, wisdom, and alignment with forces far beyond human control. In the end, the journey's culmination offered revelation, legacy, and insight, immortalizing the king's triumph over the mortal and the mystical alike, and leaving a legacy intertwined indelibly with the grandeur and mystery of the Himalayas. As the pilgrim kings descended from the highest reaches of the Himalayas, the journey shifted from the extremes of survival to a reflective, almost meditative phase. The dangers of avalanches, crevasses, and thin air remained, but the urgency of the ascent gave way to contemplation, understanding, and integration. Every step downward offered time to process experiences, to record lessons, and to reconcile the mortal trials endured with the spiritual and ethical revelations gained. Snowfields now seemed less threatening and more like mirrors reflecting the journey's cumulative wisdom. The triumphs, the losses, and the ephemeral glimpses of forces beyond ordinary perception. The mountains, having tested body, mind, and spirit, now allowed for a slow absorption of the lessons carved into each day, each ritual, and each decision made under pressure. This stage of the pilgrimage was critical for consolidating the knowledge gathered at high altitudes. Kings and their entourages meticulously documented paths, environmental cues, and ritual practices, often using symbolic language, coded sketches, or carefully hidden markings. These records served dual purposes. They preserved sacred knowledge for future generations while simultaneously maintaining secrecy from those considered unworthy or unprepared. The process of documentation became a ritual in itself, a blending of observation, interpretation, and reflection that reinforced the connection between human agency, environmental mastery, and spiritual attunement. Every note, sketch, or recording was both practical and sacred, a bridge between survival and understanding, memory and legacy. The descent also provided an opportunity for reconciliation with those who had suffered or been lost along the way. Pilgrim kings often reflected on companions who had succumbed to exposure, missteps, or the mysterious vanishings in high-altitude zones. These moments of mourning were not solely personal. They were imbued with spiritual significance. Memorial rituals, offerings at shrines, and the recounting of stories became acts of honor and remembrance, reinforcing the moral and ethical dimensions of leadership. Each loss served as a cautionary tale and a reminder that the mountains demanded both respect and vigilance, teaching that survival was inseparable from humility, empathy, and ethical responsibility. Encounters with local inhabitants, hermits, and guides gained new significance during the descent. Those who had previously provided guidance now witnessed the return of the kings, and the interactions often became opportunities for teaching and transmission of accumulated wisdom. Pilgrim kings shared insights gleaned from observation, ritual, and direct experience, blending practical guidance with moral and spiritual lessons. These exchanges reinforced the social and ethical dimensions of the pilgrimage, linking personal achievement with collective responsibility. Knowledge, like the mountains themselves, was both formidable and generous. extending through guidance, teaching, and the preservation of tradition. Psychologically, the descent offered space to integrate the altered states, visions, and intense experiences encountered at extreme altitudes. Kings recounted hallucinations, auditory phenomena, and spiritual visions with growing clarity, seeking to extract meaning and understanding. Meditation, journaling, and ritual reflection provided tools to contextualize these experiences, helping to transform fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion into insight, resilience, and wisdom. The mountains had imposed trials, but they had also revealed lessons about perception, morality, and the relationship between human will and forces beyond comprehension. The descent allowed these lessons to crystallize, converting peril into knowledge, disorientation into clarity, and mortality into insight. Environmental observation remained a central focus. Even while descending, subtle cues, snow patterns, rock formations, water flow, and wildlife behavior continued to inform navigation and ritual action. Each detail carried both practical and symbolic significance, reinforcing the understanding that mastery of the mountains required continuous attention and humility. Guides and monks acted as intermediaries between observation and interpretation, their insight helping the king to discern the meaning behind environmental signs and integrate these lessons into both the journey's practical and spiritual dimensions. Ritual practices continued during descent, though their nature shifted toward reflection, gratitude, and consolidation. Offerings at shrines became acts of acknowledgement rather than supplication, and chants often marked milestones or commemorated significant experiences. These practices strengthened the bonds within the entourage, reaffirmed the sacred alignment with the mountains, and symbolically stitched together the narrative of the journey. Ritual now served not only survival and guidance, but also the moral and spiritual integration of the experiences endured, embedding the lessons learned into both personal consciousness and collective memory. The descent also highlighted the cumulative effect of the journey on leadership and ethical discernment. Pilgrim kings emerged with heightened awareness of responsibility, empathy, and moral judgment. Decision-making during perilous ascents had tested courage, judgment, and ethical resolve. The reflection during descent allowed these qualities to consolidate, informing how kings would lead, govern, and protect their domains. The mountains functioned as an enduring teacher, demonstrating that power divorced from insight, ethics, or humility could not endure, whereas leadership forged through trial, reflection, and integration would resonate across generations. Finally, the descent reinforced the interconnectedness of human, environmental, and spiritual systems. The mountains had tested the kings physically, morally, and spiritually. The companions had supported, guided, and learned alongside them, and the knowledge and rituals preserved would inform future generations. Each step downward was a testament to survival, endurance, and comprehension. A transition from trial to mastery, from peril to insight, and from isolation to reintegration with the wider human and spiritual community. The journey, having imposed extremes, now allowed the pilgrim kings to emerge with wisdom tempered by experience, courage honed by adversity, and understanding enriched by the silent, immutable presence of the Himalayas. The descent, in essence, transformed the pilgrimage from an extraordinary physical endeavor into a deeply integrated narrative of human perseverance, ethical alignment, and spiritual awakening. It was a stage where reflection met action, where observation became insight, and where the lessons of the peaks could be safely carried back into the world below, ensuring that the Pilgrim King's legacy endured not only in legend but in practical, moral, and spiritual influence that would shape their kingdoms for generations to come. As the Pilgrim Kings made their way through the final valleys, the extremity of the mountains began to recede, giving space for reflection and integration. The sharp edges of survival, the thin air, treacherous ice, and relentless storms were behind them, yet the journey's lessons remained vivid. Each step carried memory of companions lost, paths navigated, mystical phenomena observed, and moral choices tested in moments of acute peril. The Himalayas, once formidable adversaries, had become silent teachers, shaping not only endurance but judgment, courage, and ethical insight. The kings now had the opportunity to assimilate the cumulative experiences of ascent, plateau, and descent, translating peril into wisdom, vision into clarity, and trial into understanding. Documentation and ritual were central to this stage. Every observation, every hidden path, and every subtle environmental cue was carefully recorded, often in symbolic or coded language to preserve sacred knowledge. Journals, sketches, and ritual notations became repositories of both practical guidance for future pilgrims navigating the same peaks and moral instruction, ensuring that the journey's trials could teach beyond the individual experience. Rituals shifted from immediate survival to reflection and gratitude. Offerings were made at shrines, chants were performed to honor companions who had fallen or vanished, and ceremonial acts commemorated both triumph and loss. These practices reinforced the ethical dimension of leadership and underscored the integration of physical, spiritual, and moral awareness. Interactions with surviving guides, monks, and hermits now carried heightened significance. These mentors helped contextualize visions, ethereal voices, and mysterious phenomena from the high plateaus, translating fleeting experiences into lessons applicable to governance, strategy, and ethical leadership. The mountain's tests of courage, perception, and moral discernment were reframed as universal principles. Alignment with natural and spiritual forces, attentiveness to subtle signs, and ethical responsibility as the foundation of authority. The pilgrim kings recognized that mastery was never absolute. The Himalayas demanded humility, vigilance, and the integration of experience into sustained wisdom. Emotionally, the final valleys provided space to process grief, awe, and humility. Mourning for lost companions reinforced empathy, responsibility, and ethical reflection. Awe at the grandeur of the mountains and the extraordinary phenomena encountered reminded the kings of their smallness in the face of nature's immensity, while survival highlighted human resilience and ingenuity. Every step was both literal and symbolic, descending physically while ascending morally, spiritually, and intellectually. Ultimately, this stage reinforced the interconnectedness of endurance, perception, morality, and leadership. The pilgrim kings emerged tempered by adversity, capable of integrating experience into action, and prepared to carry lessons into governance, cultural preservation, and ritual practice. The mountains had imparted more than survival. They had gifted insight, ethical clarity, and spiritual attunement, creating a legacy that would shape both the kings and the generations to follow. This final phase of descent was thus both a conclusion and a bridge between extremity and reflection, peril and wisdom, the ephemeral and the enduring. As the pilgrim kings emerged from the Himalayas into gentler valleys, the intensity of survival gave way to reflection and integration. The trials of high altitudes, thin air, freezing winds, and treacherous ice were behind them, but their experiences had transformed them in ways far deeper than physical endurance. Every step carried memory, companions lost, visions witnessed, and moral decisions made under extreme pressure. The mountains, once adversaries, had become teachers, shaping courage, perception, and ethical judgment. The kings began to synthesize these lessons, understanding that the pilgrimage's true significance lay not in conquered peaks but in the refinement of character and insight. Documentation and ritual guided this process. Journals, sketches, and coded records preserved knowledge of paths, rituals, and environmental cues, while spiritual reflection helped translate mystical encounters into actionable wisdom. Mourning rituals honored those lost, reinforcing ethical responsibility and the human cost of the journey. Guidance from monks and local sages ensured that spiritual and moral lessons were fully integrated with practical knowledge. The descent revealed the interconnectedness of survival, morality, and leadership. Decisions made in the high mountains, whom to aid, when to proceed, how to ration supplies, now resonated as ethical and strategic lessons for governance. The mountains' trials had distilled clarity. True mastery lay not in domination but alignment with forces beyond control. By the journey's end, the pilgrim kings had transformed from mere travelers into leaders tempered by adversity, insight, and moral responsibility, carrying lessons that would endure far beyond the Himalayas. The final valleys of the pilgrimage allowed the kings to consolidate physical, spiritual, and ethical lessons. Every vision, every ritual, and every trial was revisited and integrated into an understanding of human resilience and leadership. The mountain's extremes had revealed the limits of perception, the fragility of life, and the necessity of ethical and spiritual alignment. Reflection transformed these experiences into wisdom, preparing the kings to apply lessons from perilous heights to governance and legacy. Journals, symbolic sketches, and ritual notations became repositories of knowledge, ensuring that survival techniques, ethical insights, and spiritual guidance could endure for future generations. Rituals now emphasized gratitude, acknowledgement, and the integration of experience rather than immediate survival, reinforcing both personal growth and collective memory. Mourning companions who had fallen preserved ethical awareness and strengthened bonds among survivors. Spiritual reflection deepened understanding of ethereal visions, voices, and mystical phenomena. Monks guided the kings in translating these encounters into principles of perception, morality, and leadership. Insights gained at extreme altitudes were reframed as tools for decision-making, ethical conduct, and spiritual attunement in their kingdoms. The pilgrimage's culmination demonstrated that true mastery is alignment with natural and spiritual forces, not domination over them, and that endurance, ethical clarity, and insight are inseparable. By the end, the kings carried both wisdom and legacy. They returned as leaders tempered by the mountain's challenges, equipped with knowledge, ritual, and moral insight to guide generations. The Himalayas' mysteries remained, a silent testament to the interplay of human courage, ethical responsibility, and the sublime, shaping both personal transformation and historical memory. The pilgrimage concluded with the pilgrim-kings standing between the mountains and civilization, transformed by the cumulative trials of the Himalayas. Survival, peril, and mystery had given way to reflection, insight, and the integration of physical, ethical, and spiritual lessons. The mountains, once insurmountable, had become teachers, revealing the limits of human perception, the importance of moral discernment, and the interdependence of courage, humility, and leadership. Documentation and ritual preserved the journey's knowledge and meaning. Journals, coded sketches, and ceremonial acts ensured that insights into survival, navigation, ethical responsibility, and spiritual attunement endured. Mourning rituals honored companions lost, embedding lessons in empathy and ethical reflection. These records and rituals became a living legacy, bridging the mountain's challenges with governance, cultural preservation, and moral guidance for future generations. Spiritual lessons previously experienced under extreme conditions were now fully integrated. Visions, voices, and phenomena were understood as guides to perception, ethics, and leadership. Monks and advisors helped translate these experiences into actionable insight, showing that true mastery lay in alignment with forces beyond control and in harmonizing action, morality, and understanding. Finally, the kings carried forward the pilgrimage's legacy, demonstrating that endurance, ethical clarity, and insight are inseparable from leadership and human experience. The mountains, eternal and enigmatic, remained a symbol of transformation and wisdom. The journey was not merely survival but a profound odyssey shaping character, governance, and consciousness. The Himalayas had imparted endurance, insight, and legacy, leaving the kings forever changed, and their story a testament to courage, moral discernment, and the sublime interplay of human endeavor and the natural world.